The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, brought by courier in Harrington livery to the modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, where Charlotte Ashford had resided with her father since her mother's death 3 years previous. She had observed the letter's arrival from her position at the window. The fine quality of paper, the official seal, the careful deliberation with which the courier had placed it in her father's hands. She had known, without requiring to be told, that the letter contained something significant. Letters bearing ducal seals did not arrive at houses such as theirs for matters of inconsequence. Her father had read the letter twice in silence, seated at the modest writing desk in the morning room. Charlotte had watched the colour drain from his face, had observed the particular quality of trembling that seized his hands, had recognized in his expression the manifestation of hope so desperate that it was nearly indistinguishable from terror. Only when he had finally looked toward her, only when he had gestured for her to come and read the letter herself, did Charlotte fully comprehend what had occurred. The letter was from the Dowager Duchess Catherine Harrington, written in precise, controlled hand that suggested both aristocratic training and considerable intelligence. It was addressed not to Charlotte's father, but to Charlotte herself, a courtesy that immediately distinguished it from ordinary social correspondence. The content was straightforward, delivered without elaboration or sentimentality. The Duke of Ravenswick, the letter stated, had determined that marriage was now a necessity of his position. The Dowager Duchess was instructed to identify appropriate candidate from among families of respectable lineage but modest circumstances. The Duke desired a woman of intelligence, of practical capability, of sufficient education to comprehend her responsibilities, and of sufficient discretion to manage the particular requirements of his household. After careful consideration and discreet inquiry, the Dowager Duchess had identified Miss Charlotte Ashford as meeting these specifications. The letter proposed, with courtesy that was unmistakably also command, that Charlotte visit Ravenswick House for a fortnight, ostensibly as guest of the Dowager Duchess. During this visit she might determine whether she was willing to accept a proposal of marriage from the Duke. The proposal, the letter indicated with careful phrasing, would come with considerable financial settlement, would ensure the security of Charlotte's father for remainder of his life, and would position Charlotte as one of the highest-ranking women in England. The letter closed with observation that the Duke preferred expeditious arrangements. Should Charlotte accept, marriage could occur within 8 weeks of her arrival at Ravenswick House. "You will go," her father had said finally, after Charlotte had read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to comprehend that such extraordinary reversal of circumstance could occur. "You will go, Charlotte, and you will accept. This is the kind of intervention that families such as ours are not granted twice. You will go, and you will conduct yourself with intelligence and dignity, and you will accept whatever proposal the Duke offers." She had not asked her father what he knew of the Duke of Ravenswick. She had not asked why a man of such extraordinary position and privilege would require to marry a woman from family such as theirs. She had not asked what might be wrong with the Duke that required such careful arrangement of marriage rather than conventional courtship. She had not asked because she understood that her father did not possess answers to such questions, and because asking would suggest that she was contemplating refusal, which was something that could not be contemplated. Instead, she had simply nodded, had asked about practical matters regarding what she would require to pack for a fortnight at the residence of Dowager Duchess, and had begun the process of preparing herself for transformation that she did not fully comprehend. The journey to Ravenswick House had taken most of a day, the carriage travelling north from London through countryside that grew increasingly prosperous and increasingly rural. Charlotte had observed the estates they passed, the evidence of wealth and careful management, the manner in which the landscape itself seemed to acknowledge the power and position of the families that controlled it. She had felt, with each mile that transported her further from Bloomsbury, a particular quality of unreality, as though she were being conveyed not into different circumstance, but into different world entirely. Ravenswick House itself had been rather more overwhelming than Charlotte's imagination had prepared her for. The drive approached through parkland that extended for what seemed like miles, carefully managed woodland, alternating with open areas where deer grazed. The house itself was extraordinary, not merely large but magnificent, built in Elizabethan period and added to across subsequent centuries in manner that suggested unlimited resources and confident aesthetic judgment. The facade was of honey-colored stone, the windows numerous enough to suggest that interior was characterized by remarkable light and openness. The entrance portico was supported by columns of classical proportion, suggesting that the house carried within it not merely wealth, but culture and refinement. The Dowager Duchess had received her in drawing room that overlooked formal gardens, a space of such considerable elegance that Charlotte had felt rather painfully aware of the limitations of her own dress, despite its being the finest she possessed. Catherine Harrington herself had been rather more formidable than Charlotte's apprehension had anticipated. She was a woman of advanced age, perhaps in her late 60s, with silver hair arranged with perfect precision and eyes that seemed to assess Charlotte with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making rapid judgments about character. "You are not what I expected," Catherine had observed, after studying Charlotte for a moment that extended long enough to be uncomfortable. "You are smaller than I anticipated, less fashionably dressed. You carry yourself with less obvious confidence than society women typically do." Charlotte had not known how to respond to this observation. She had certainly not expected that the Dowager Duchess would open conversation with implied criticism of her appearance. "However," Catherine had continued, with the slight inclination of head that suggested something that might almost have been approval, "you appear to possess intelligence. Your eyes suggest that you observe carefully. You did not attempt false brightness when you entered this room, nor did you deploy excessive deference. You entered as woman attempting to navigate circumstance she does not fully comprehend. This suggests capability." "I am grateful for the opportunity to visit Ravenswick House, Your Grace," Charlotte had replied carefully, having concluded that honest simplicity was preferable to the elaborate courtesy that might have been expected. "I confess that I do not fully comprehend the circumstances that have resulted in the Dowager Duchess's interest in my family. I am uncertain what I might possess that would be of interest to a man of the Duke's position and capability." The slight smile that had appeared on Catherine's face suggested that this response had been appropriate. "Then we shall spend your fortnight helping you comprehend both the circumstances and the particular requirements of the position you are being offered," Catherine had said. "But first, you should understand that my son is not what society believes him to be. You should understand that the marriage he is proposing is not motivated by sentiment or by conventional romantic inclination. You should understand that this marriage will require of you capabilities and particular qualities of character that extend considerably beyond what is normally expected of a wife." "What is wrong with the Duke?" Charlotte had asked, the question emerging before she had quite determined that she should ask it. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I do not mean to be presumptuous, but I would prefer to understand what circumstances I am being asked to accept, rather than to arrive at the altar in ignorance." The Dowager Duchess had regarded her for a long moment, and Charlotte had observed the particular quality of sadness that had crossed the older woman's expression. Sadness so profound and so carefully concealed that Charlotte recognized it as something that Catherine had been managing for considerable time. "My son is dying," Catherine had said finally, with the directness of someone who had learned that elaborate courtesy could not soften the reality that required to be conveyed. "He is dying slowly, in manner that requires considerable time yet, but he is dying nonetheless. This is not something that society comprehends. This is not something that is commonly acknowledged, but it is the reason he has determined that marriage is now necessary. He wishes to produce legitimate heir before he is no longer capable of doing so." The reality of this statement had rendered Charlotte momentarily speechless. She had come to Ravenswick House expecting to understand that she was being offered advantageous marriage. She had not anticipated understanding that she was being offered marriage to man who had specified duration of his remaining life. "He is selecting me because he understands that I will not expect him to survive?" Charlotte had asked, attempting to comprehend the implications of what Catherine had articulated. "He is selecting you because he believes you possess the capability to survive his death with sufficient grace to ensure that the heir he produces is raised in circumstances conducive to genuine well-being," Catherine had replied. "He is selecting you because he believes you will not regard this marriage as opportunity for personal advancement, but rather as obligation you will undertake with dignity and competence. He is selecting you, Charlotte, because he believes you are capable of the particular sacrifice that this marriage requires." That had been nearly a week previous. Since then, Charlotte had been conducted through Ravenswick House, had been introduced to various household staff, had been provided with wardrobe additions befitting her new status as prospective Duchess, and had been offered no opportunity whatsoever to actually encounter the Duke. She had inquired regarding whether she might meet with Adrian, and Catherine had responded that Adrian preferred to permit Charlotte time to acclimate to her surroundings before conducting formal introduction. This delay had generated in Charlotte a curious quality of emotion, simultaneous relief at avoiding confrontation with dying man, and anxiety regarding what such avoidance might indicate regarding her capacity to manage the reality of the marriage she was contemplating. It was on the 7th day of her visit that the summons had come. Mrs. Hartwick, the head housekeeper, had delivered message that the Duke requested Charlotte's presence in the library at 8 o'clock in the evening. Charlotte had spent the intervening hours in state of considerable agitation, had changed her dress 3 times, had finally settled on gown of palest blue, chosen not for its fashionability, but for the manner it suggested capability and composure, rather than desperate courtship. She had attempted to calm her nerves by reminding herself that she had already accepted the essential reality of the situation, marriage to dying Duke in exchange for security and position. Meeting the Duke himself could not alter what had already been determined. Yet when she had entered the library, a space of remarkable dimension, lined with books from floor to ceiling, illuminated by fire in elaborate fireplace and by candles placed on various tables, and had observed the man who stood at the window, his posture suggesting both aristocratic bearing and profound physical exhaustion, she had recognized that meeting the Duke himself altered everything quite substantially. He was older than she had anticipated, marked by years of responsible authority and by something else that she could not quite identify, something that suggested weight carried beyond what should have been required of any single human being. His hair was an unusual color, dark blonde mixed with silver in manner suggesting either premature aging or years of considerable stress. He was taller than she was, but in manner that suggested his height had come from bone structure rather than robust physical presence. He seemed somewhat diminished, as though his frame was carrying less weight than it should. His hands, when he turned to acknowledge her entrance, bore a scar on the right, a thin line running from wrist to middle finger, suggesting some past injury. But it was his eyes that arrested her full attention. They were an unusual color, warm amber gold, and they assessed her with intelligence that was entirely undiminished by whatever physical condition had diminished his body. In that gaze, Charlotte perceived not the dying man that Catherine had described, but rather man of considerable capability and considerable loneliness. She perceived, in the particular quality of his observation, the recognition that he was regarding woman who would, if she accepted his proposal, undertake sacrifice of her own future for obligation to his. "Miss Ashford," he said finally, his voice carrying the precise accent of aristocratic privilege and the careful control of someone managing considerable physical discomfort. "I am Adrian Harrington. You may have observed that my mother has been somewhat lengthy in arranging our introduction. I wish to assure you that the delay was not discourtesy, but rather deliberate effort to permit you to understand the nature of what you are being asked to accept before you were required to confront the reality of accepting it from me directly." "Your Grace," Charlotte replied, and was surprised to note that her voice carried steadiness despite the particular intensity of the moment. "I confess that I am uncertain what response you anticipate from me. I have been offered position and security in exchange for marriage to man whose condition has been described to me with considerable candor. I remain uncertain what you expect me to say in response to direct acknowledgement of this arrangement." The faintest smile had appeared at corner of Adrian's mouth, the suggestion of appreciation for her directness. "I expect you to tell me whether you are willing to undertake this obligation," he said. "I expect you to tell me what terms you would require in order to consent to marriage to man who has chosen you not for romantic sentiment, but for specific qualities he believes you to possess. I expect you, Charlotte, to understand that this marriage is transaction, and to negotiate that transaction on terms that protect your own interests and ensure your own security." "And what happens if I refuse?" Charlotte had asked, the question emerging with less hesitation than she would have anticipated. "You are provided with generous financial compensation, you are returned to London, and my mother begins the process of identifying alternative candidate," Adrian had replied, with the directness that was beginning to seem characteristic of him. "Your father's financial difficulties are addressed in any case. My mother would not be capable of recruiting woman with your father's liability if she did not ensure his security, regardless of your acceptance or refusal of my proposal. But I hope, Charlotte, that you will not refuse, because I believe that you possess capability to become Duchess in manner that would benefit not merely my household, but the estates and communities for which I am responsible. I believe that you possess intelligence sufficient to understand why I have chosen you, and I believe, though I have no right to expect it, that you might eventually develop not merely respect for this arrangement, but something approaching genuine partnership. Charlotte had looked at him, at this man who was carefully managing pain she could not see, who was offering her security and position at cost she could not fully calculate, and she had recognized that her answer had been determined from the moment the letter had arrived. She was going to marry this dying duke. She was going to undertake this obligation. She was going to attempt to become the Duchess he believed her capable of becoming. "Then I accept your grace," she had said quietly, "on condition that you will permit me to understand, gradually and without demand for immediate performance of obligations, what this marriage will require of me. On condition that you will regard me with sufficient honesty that I am never uncertain what you expect. On condition that you will permit me to develop whatever capability I am capable of developing, rather than regarding me as woman who has already been formed by prior circumstance." Adrian had moved from the window then, had approached her with movement that suggested considerable effort, and had taken her hand with gentleness that had surprised her. "Then we have agreement," he had said. "I will endeavor to be worthy of the sacrifice you are undertaking, Charlotte. I will attempt to ensure that this marriage offers you something of value in exchange for what you are sacrificing. And I will tell you, though I have perhaps no right to make such promise, that you were chosen not merely by duty, but because something in my mother's description of you suggested that you were a woman I wish to know, regardless of the practical requirements that demand our marriage occur." He had released her hand then, and had returned to the window, his posture suggesting that the brief conversation had exhausted his physical reserves. Charlotte had departed the library, had made her way back to her appointed chamber, and had sat upon the bed for considerable time, attempting to comprehend that her life had been, in space of brief conversation, fundamentally and permanently altered. The formal betrothal announcement had been submitted to the Times and the Morning Post the following day, creating immediate response throughout London society. The news that the Duke of Ravenswick, man whose status and position had seemed to position him as permanent bachelor despite his years, had selected as bride a woman from family of such modest circumstance generated considerable speculation and not insignificant criticism. Charlotte had observed, during her remaining days at Ravenswick House before departure to fulfill obligations of official engagement period, the particular quality of response that her prospective marriage had generated. The drawing rooms of London society, when she and Catherine had made required visits to greet family connections and offer explanation for the unexpected union, had been characterized by expressions of surprise that were not quite polite, by questions framed in manner suggesting skepticism regarding both the Duke's judgment and Charlotte's suitability. "The Duke must be more desperately in need of heir than we have comprehended," one particular society matron had murmured within Charlotte's hearing, her voice suggesting that marriage to woman of Charlotte's standing could only have been motivated by absolute necessity. One almost sympathizes with his desperation to be compelled toward such obvious mismatch. Yet Catherine had moved through such observations with complete disregard for their implications, had responded to inquiries regarding Charlotte's family, accomplishments, and education with straightforward pride, and had made clear through her behavior that she regarded the marriage as entirely suitable arrangement, rather than as evidence of any desperation on Adrian's part. "My son has selected wife who will be capable Duchess," Catherine had stated to one particularly persistent inquirer, with the kind of finality that suggested the matter was not open to further discussion. "He has selected woman of intelligence and character. He has made choice that he is satisfied with. This is, I believe, sufficient." During Charlotte's return to Bloomsbury to prepare for marriage and to conduct necessary business regarding her father's affairs, she had received a letter from Adrian. The letter was formal in its beginning, addressed to "my dearest Charlotte," in manner suggesting the structure of proper correspondence between engaged couple, yet the content was considerably more intimate than the formality of address might have suggested. Adrian had written regarding his understanding that she must be experiencing considerable doubt regarding the wisdom of her acceptance. He had written that he wished to explain, with greater clarity than had been possible in their brief conversation in the library, exactly what the marriage would require of her. He had written with particular attention to matters of physical intimacy. "You should understand," his letter had stated, "that I am not capable of providing for a wife the full range of physical companionship that a healthy husband might provide. There are days when I am capable of little more than existing. There are nights when pain prevents sleep, and there are mornings when simple movement generates considerable suffering. I wish to be clear regarding these limitations before you come to our marriage bed, with expectations that I cannot fulfill. I wish to be clear that if you require physical companionship as condition of accepting this marriage, I cannot promise such companionship. What I can promise is that I will endeavor to show you respect and care within the boundaries of what my condition permits. What I can promise is that the intimate aspects of our marriage will be undertaken only with your genuine consent and your genuine comfort. What I can promise is that if there are aspects of this marriage that cause you distress, I wish to know of them and to adjust them to whatever extent I am capable. The letter had continued, addressing practical matters regarding Charlotte's role as Duchess. Adrian had written regarding the structure of household management, the expectations regarding social engagement, the manner in which his condition would require to be managed without being publicly acknowledged. He had written with considerable specificity, suggesting that he had devoted considerable thought to how the marriage could be arranged to ensure that Charlotte could fulfill her obligations while he managed the increasingly significant burden of his illness. Most remarkably, he had written a paragraph that seemed to suggest his understanding of what Charlotte was sacrificing. I wish to acknowledge what you are undertaking in accepting this marriage. You are sacrificing the possibility of marriage to man who could offer you the full companionship of a healthy partner. You are undertaking obligation that will almost certainly result in your becoming widow at a point in your life when you might otherwise possess decades of opportunity before you. You are accepting position that is public and demanding while married to man whose capacity to share that position will be progressively limited. I wish you to know that I recognize these sacrifices. I wish you to know that I am grateful for them, even as I recognize that gratitude cannot adequately compensate for what you are giving. I wish you to know that if there is anything I can do to make this obligation less crushing, I am committed to doing it. Charlotte had read this letter numerous times, had found herself affected by the particular quality of understanding that Adrian demonstrated regarding her situation. She had expected that the Duke would regard the marriage as simple transaction, woman's compliance in exchange for security and position. Instead, she was encountering man who seemed to comprehend that the marriage was genuine sacrifice on her part and who seemed to be attempting, within the constraints of his own condition and social position, to mitigate the cost of that sacrifice. Her father, observing the letter when Charlotte had permitted him to read it, had commented with something approaching wonder in his voice. He understands what he is asking of you. He comprehends it. This is not man who is merely using your acceptance for his own benefit. This is man attempting, even within his limitations, to offer you something of value in exchange. The wedding day had arrived with remarkable speed, the weeks between betrothal and marriage seeming to pass with dreamlike quality. Charlotte had been provided with dress of white silk and lace, with the veil and flowers that society dictated, with all the external trappings of bride that she felt utterly separated from as she stood in the vestry of St. James's Church and observed her reflection in mirror. She had looked, she recognized, like woman playing role of bride, rather than woman preparing to undertake marriage. The white dress had been sophisticated and expensive, had been designed by finest modiste in London. Yet it had seemed to belong to some other woman, someone more confident, someone more accustomed to privilege, someone who had not been transported into this position through combination of family desperation and Duke's particular requirements. Victoria, attending as bridesmaid, had squeezed her hand with wordless understanding. "You look beautiful," Victoria had whispered, and terrified. These seemed to be compatible conditions for bride, particularly bride in your particular circumstances. Hold your head high, you are walking toward genuine man of genuine intelligence who has selected you deliberately. That is considerably more than most women receive. The ceremony had proceeded according to all the formalities that society required. Charlotte had walked toward Adrian, who had stood at the altar with bearing that suggested no weakness, despite what she now understood to be the considerable cost of his physical presence. She had exchanged vows with man who was stranger to her in all practical sense, had accepted ring from hands that trembled slightly, whether from emotion or from pain she could not determine, and had become, in moments that seemed to exist outside normal time, Duchess of Ravenswick. The wedding breakfast had followed, attended by the considerable assemblage of family and society connections that Adrian's position demanded. Charlotte had smiled, had acknowledged congratulations, had performed the role of happy bride with capability that surprised her. She had observed society women regarding her with mixture of envy regarding her new position and skepticism regarding her suitability for it. She had perceived in their observations the recognition that she had accomplished remarkable advancement despite her lack of conventional advantages. Yet it was the moment when Adrian had taken her hand publicly, in manner suggesting possession, yet also suggesting genuine affection, that Charlotte had recognized the particular reality of her new position. She belonged to him now, in manner that society fully comprehended and approved. She was bound to him through vows that were binding regardless of their sentiment. She was positioned to share his life, his burden, his illness, his approaching death, for all the time remaining to them. It was only as evening had approached, and as Charlotte had been conducted by Mrs. Hartwick to the chambers that had been prepared for the Duke and new Duchess, that the full weight of what the day had accomplished had begun to manifest. The chambers occupied by the Duke and Duchess were substantial, located in wing of Ravenswick House that had been renovated specifically for their use. The drawing room was of considerable elegance, appointed with furniture of fine quality and with windows overlooking the formal gardens. The bedchamber was equally impressive, a space of considerable dimension, with canopied bed that was works of art in itself, with elaborate furnishings suggesting both comfort and considerable expense. Mrs. Hartwick had prepared Charlotte for bed, with the efficiency of someone who had undertaken this duty for numerous brides, had ensured that the chamber was appropriately lit with candles positioned to create ambiance that was neither so bright as to be harsh nor so dim as to suggest impropriety. She had dressed Charlotte in nightgown of finest linen, had removed the elaborate arrangement of hair that had characterized the day's styling, had generally attended to all the practical matters that permitted Charlotte to transition from Duchess in wedding dress to woman preparing to share marriage bed. "The Duke has been resting," Mrs. Hartwick had said quietly, in manner suggesting that she was offering information that Charlotte required but did not quite know to request. "He undertook considerable physical effort for the ceremonies. Dr. Mercer has assured him that this will not be harmful. He has indicated that he wishes to speak with you regarding the evening's particular requirements." Charlotte had nodded, trying to manage the particular quality of anxiety that had begun to manifest with intensifying force as the hour of Adrian's arrival had approached. She had undertaken study of marital obligations in manner that was both theoretical and deeply uncomfortable, had understood the essential mechanics of what was expected of wife on wedding night, and had simultaneously endeavored to prepare herself mentally for intimacy with man who was still essentially stranger to her. Adrian had arrived perhaps an hour after Mrs. Hartwick's departure, had entered the bedchamber with movement that suggested he had required to manage considerable physical discomfort in order to accomplish the simple act of crossing from his dressing room to the shared chamber. He had been wearing dressing gown of fine brocade, yet Charlotte had observed that beneath the garment his frame suggested diminishment that made the elaborate fabric appear almost comical in its excess. He had observed her apprehension with precision that suggested he had anticipated exactly the manifestation of anxiety that she was experiencing, and he had moved, with considerably more gentleness than she had expected from man of his authority, to sit beside her on the bed rather than approaching her with any suggestion of demand. "Charlotte," he had said, his voice characterized by the same careful control that had marked his letter, "I wish to discuss what is about to occur between us. I wish to discuss it with adequate frankness, that you understand what I am capable of and what I am not capable of. I wish to discuss it in manner that permits you to establish boundaries that I will respect absolutely." "I understand my obligations as wife," Charlotte had replied, attempting to marshal the courage that she understood was required of her, attempting to position herself mentally for whatever physical intimacy Adrian intended to undertake. "Your obligations," Adrian had repeated, and she had detected something that might have been sadness in his voice, "are considerably more limited than society generally understands them to be. Your obligations, Charlotte, extend only to what you genuinely consent to. Your obligations extend only to what does not cause you distress. Your obligations do not extend to permitting me to undertake actions that cause you pain or discomfort." He had paused then, and Charlotte had observed the particular way he held himself, the manner in which he seemed to be managing something that caused him considerable difficulty. "I will tell you something that society does not understand," he had continued quietly. "I am dying, you know this. What you may not fully comprehend is what dying means for a man of my position. It means that I must maintain appearance of health and capability when I am present in public. It means that I manage considerable pain throughout my daily existence. It means that there are aspects of my body that are compromised in manner that would be difficult for any wife to accept." He had stood then, moved to close and bar the door to the chamber, and had removed his dressing gown. Charlotte had not been prepared for what she observed. Adrian's body was marked, scarred, thinned, visibly diminished from what a man of his strength and authority might have been expected to possess. But more significantly, she had observed the particular quality of resignation and almost defiance in his bearing, the manner in which he was presenting himself to her, not with shame, but with deliberate transparency. "This is what I am," Adrian had said simply. "This is the body that is offering you marriage. This is the physical reality beneath the title and the position. I am telling you this not as invitation to pity, but as statement of fact that I believe you should see without pretense or concealment." Charlotte had stood then, and she had approached him, and she had done something that he clearly had not anticipated. She had taken his hand, and she had observed his scars with the same kind of careful attention that he had clearly been offering her for the entirety of their brief acquaintance. "You have asked me to understand the sacrifices you are making," Charlotte had said quietly. "I believe I am beginning to do so. But I wish to ask you something, Adrian. Why me? Why have you selected not woman of your own sphere, woman already accustomed to the world you inhabit, but woman such as me, without aristocratic training and without social position? Why have you put your well-being into the hands of someone so clearly unprepared?" Adrian had led her back to the bed then, had sat beside her, and had finally, it seemed, permitted some of the careful control to diminish from his voice. "Because I had observed," he had said, "that women of my own sphere regarded me with terror regarding my position and with calculation regarding my wealth. Because I had observed that women trained to society regarded marriage as transaction designed to secure their own position, without genuine capacity for seeing the person they were marrying. Because my mother, in her description of you, suggested woman who possessed capacity to see beyond surface, to understand necessity, to accept reality without demanding that it be transformed into something more comfortable. And because," he had paused then, and his voice had become something that sounded very much like confession, "I have endured considerable loneliness in knowing that I am dying, and I wished, before I died, to be known by someone who was seeing me not as duke, but as man. I wished to be chosen for something approaching authentic reason rather than for the position I hold. You were chosen, Charlotte, because I believed you might actually see me." What had followed then had not been the formal completion of marital obligation that Charlotte had anticipated. Instead, Adrian had held her, simply held her, his arms around her with gentleness, but also with something that felt very much like gratitude. They had remained thus without further physical intimacy, while the candles had burned down and the night had deepened around them. It was only in the early morning hours, when Charlotte had believed Adrian to be asleep, that she had fully recognized what had occurred. She had not been married to acquire position. She had been married to provide authentic human connection to man, who had understood with absolute clarity that his time was limited and his capacity for genuine companionship more limited still. She had been chosen not by duty, as Adrian had said to her at the outset, but by something that, despite its beginning in practical necessity, was beginning to demonstrate characteristics of something approaching genuine regard. The morning following the wedding night had arrived with particular quality of awkwardness that Charlotte had not quite anticipated. She had awakened to discover Adrian had already departed the chamber, had apparently risen without disturbing her, had apparently returned to the careful management of his day that did not permit for extended indulgence in luxuries such as remaining in bed in companionship with wife. Mrs. Hartwick had appeared shortly after Charlotte had awakened, had brought with her all the particulars of morning routine: hot water for washing, tea and light breakfast, assistance in dressing. Yet the housekeeper had also brought with her something more significant: detailed explanation of Charlotte's obligations as Duchess of Ravenswick. "The households are considerable," Mrs. Hartwick had explained, as she had assisted Charlotte in selecting appropriate dress for her first full day as Duchess, selecting ultimately for gown of dove grey that suggested both dignity and accessibility, garment that would permit Charlotte to move through the house without appearing either inappropriately grand or inappropriately humble. "There is the London house in addition to this one. There are 3 smaller estates that require oversight. There is considerable staff that requires coordination. The previous Duchess, the late Duke's wife, God rest her, managed household with considerable efficiency. The Dowager Duchess has maintained management since her daughter-in-law's death, but she has been hoping for opportunity to relinquish responsibility to younger woman." "How long ago did the previous Duchess pass?" Charlotte had asked, the question emerging with some hesitation, as she was uncertain how much personal information regarding Adrian's first marriage was appropriate for her to possess. 14 years ago now, Mrs. Hartwick had replied, in tones suggesting that this was information of some significance. The marriage had been 17 years' duration. They had been married when they were young, both of them of age and both of them trained since childhood to understand the obligations that such marriage would require. The Duchess bore 2 children, a son who is now at university and a daughter who is 15 and currently residing with relations in Hampshire. Neither of the children are acknowledged as living in the Duke's household, as such arrangement would have been considered irregular after the Duchess's death. Charlotte had absorbed this information with particular attention, recognizing that she was being offered understanding of the particular complexity of Adrian's situation. He was widower of 14 years standing. He had children who were being raised separately from him. He was attempting to produce heir despite having already fathered 2 children with previous wife. All of this suggested layers of complexity regarding his motivation for the marriage that extended considerably beyond what he had articulated to her thus far. The Duke has not spoken regarding his children, Charlotte had observed, phrasing the comment as statement rather than question. No, he has not, Mrs. Hartwick had agreed. It is not my place to explain why he prefers not to maintain household relationships with them. I will only observe that the circumstances that resulted in their separation from him were not circumstances that he selected. They were arrangements made by relations of the previous Duchess, arrangements that he has attempted to respect in honor of his first wife's memory and in service of the children's well-being. But this is information that you might wish to inquire regarding directly with the Duke, as it is matter that affects your position as Duchess considerably. The day that had followed had been occupied with systematic introduction to the vast machinery of household management. Mrs. Hartwick had conducted Charlotte through storage rooms containing linens, had introduced her to kitchen staff, had explained the organization of household accounts, had guided her through the drawing rooms and reception areas that would require careful maintenance and management. More importantly, Mrs. Hartwick had introduced Charlotte to the cadre of servants who managed daily operations, the head gardener, the steward responsible for estate management, the various housemaids and footmen and kitchen staff that represented layers of hierarchy and specialization that Charlotte had not previously understood to be necessary. Yet it was in the late afternoon, as Charlotte had been seated with the housekeeper, reviewing the previous Duchess's records regarding household accounts, that the first real challenge to her position had presented itself. A footman had appeared in the doorway, had announced with particular formality that His Lordship the Marquis Harrington wishes to present his respects to Her Grace. James had appeared almost immediately following this announcement, had conducted himself with all the courtesy that society required, and had made clear through the particular quality of his observation that he was undertaking systematic assessment of Charlotte's capability and her fitness for the position she now occupied. "My sister-in-law," he had said, with smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "I trust you are adjusting appropriately to your new responsibilities. This household is not insubstantial in its management requirements. It is, I believe, considerably more complex than what you might have been accustomed to managing in your previous circumstances. I am discovering that household management requires application of intelligence and attention to detail," Charlotte had replied, maintaining composure despite the particular quality of antagonism that James was projecting. "I am confident that with time, and with the assistance of capable staff such as Mrs. Hartwick, I will be capable of managing whatever requirements the position demands." "How admirable that you possess such confidence in your own capability," James had observed, positioning himself with deliberate casualness in the chair beside her, as though he had not been invited to occupy it. "I confess that I have been somewhat concerned regarding whether a woman of your particular background would be capable of understanding the particular obligations that our family position requires. Our connections extend throughout society. Our reputation is considerable. It requires careful management to maintain such position without scandal or impropriety. I understand that the Dowager Duchess has maintained considerable responsibility for such matters," Charlotte had replied with careful precision. "I am certain that she will continue to offer guidance regarding matters of family reputation, but I also understand that my obligation is to manage household and estates with competence and care. I believe such competent management is contribution sufficient to the family's position." The moment had been interrupted, almost as though deliberately, Charlotte had observed, by arrival of Adrian. He had entered the room with movement that suggested he had required to manage considerable pain in order to accomplish what was merely a walk of perhaps 50 feet from his study. He had observed James with expression that had suggested something approaching coldness, and he had moved directly to Charlotte's side with gesture of possession that was unmistakable in its meaning. "James," Adrian had said, his voice carrying the particular ice of aristocratic authority deployed toward subordinate. "I was not aware that you had informed me of intention to call upon Charlotte today. I was under the impression that you were intended to be occupied with estate matters in the north." "I found myself unexpectedly at liberty," James had replied, with a smile that had suggested he was not remotely troubled by Adrian's coolness. "I wished to offer my respects to Charlotte and to ensure that she was adjusting adequately to her new position. I would have thought you would appreciate my concern for her well-being." "Your concern for Charlotte's well-being is something that I regard with appropriate skepticism," Adrian had responded, with clarity that had suggested he was no longer even attempting to mask his dislike of his brother. "I believe that your concern is primarily directed toward understanding whether Charlotte will adequately fulfill her obligations or whether her inadequacy might provide opportunity for some alternative arrangement regarding succession." James had stood then, had conducted himself with continued courtesy despite the clear dismissal that Adrian had delivered, and had departed the drawing room with expression that suggested he was calculating what his next approach might be. "I apologize for my brother's behavior," Adrian had said, once James had departed with sufficient distance that conversation could occur without risk of being overheard. "James has never been capable of genuine courtesy. He regards this marriage as threat to his position and his expectations. He will continue to undertake attempts to assess whether you are adequate to the demands of this position. He will continue to search for evidence of inadequacy that might justify his resistance to accepting you as Duchess." "Why does my adequacy or inadequacy as Duchess threaten his position?" Charlotte had asked, the question emerging with genuine curiosity. "Surely your position as Duke is not threatened by your marriage to a woman of modest background. Surely his expectations regarding succession are not altered by whether I am capable or incapable of managing household." Adrian had moved to the window then, had positioned himself in manner suggesting he was managing pain that required to be concealed from Charlotte's direct observation. "My brother has been calculating," he had said finally, "since the moment of our father's death, the possibility that I might die without producing heir. If I were to die without heir, the dukedom would pass to James. His expectations have been shaped around this possibility for 17 years, the entire duration of my first marriage, when no second child was produced, the 14 years since my first wife's death. He has been positioning himself, cultivating alliances, preparing himself for the eventuality that he might become Duke." "And now?" Charlotte had asked, understanding beginning to manifest regarding the implications of what Adrian was articulating. "Now," Adrian had replied, "you have become the barrier between him and the dukedom. If you bear son, if you produce legitimate heir to the title, then the prospect that he has been cultivating for so long becomes impossible. This is why he will regard you with antagonism. This is why he will search for evidence of your inadequacy or of my poor judgment in selecting you. He is fundamentally threatened by your presence and by what your presence implies." That evening, Charlotte had dined alone with Adrian, a meal that had been served in small dining room rather than in the formal dining hall, where more elaborate entertaining would have occurred. Adrian had appeared somewhat diminished by the day's exertions, had eaten very little, yet had remained engaged in conversation with intensity that suggested his mind was considerably less fatigued than his body. "I wish to tell you regarding my children," he had said finally, as they had been taking tea in the drawing room following dinner. "I believe you should understand their existence, should understand why they are not present in this household, should understand what circumstances resulted in their being raised separately from me. I believe such understanding will assist you in comprehending certain aspects of my position and my motivation regarding this marriage." Charlotte had waited, understanding that Adrian was preparing himself to articulate something that caused him considerable difficulty. "My first wife," he had continued, "was daughter of the Marquess of Pemberton. The marriage was arranged when we were both young. This was considered appropriate at the time. She bore son when we were married only 3 years. She bore daughter 2 years later. She died when the daughter was an infant, died of complication following childbirth that the physicians proved inadequate to manage. Following her death, the Marquess, my wife's father, took control of both children. He claimed that they should be raised among their maternal relations, that he could provide them with advantages that I could not. I was young, I was grieving, I was inadequate to the challenge of raising young children alone. I permitted the arrangement. He had paused, had taken tea in manner suggesting the act itself was necessary intervention. I have regretted that permission for every moment since, he had continued quietly. I have failed in my obligation to know my own children. I have failed in my obligation to raise them. I have failed in my obligation to provide them with father's guidance and father's protection. My wife's father has raised them to regard me with distance and with some degree of contempt. I have been cast in role of man who relinquished his children, who chose to remain separate from them. And I have been incapable of reversing this arrangement, as doing so would have required confronting the Marquess in manner that might have damaged the children's peace and their standing among their maternal relations. And the heir you require, Charlotte had observed, the question forming with clarity, is heir who will grow within this household, who will be raised by you, who will not be separated from you as your other children have been separated. Yes, Adrian had confirmed. The heir I require is child who will remain with me, child who will know me as father, child who will not be stolen from me by family obligation or by my own weakness and grief. This is what I require from this marriage, Charlotte. Not merely biological heir to carry on the dukedom, but child whom I might know, whom I might raise, whom I might love without separation and without failure. The autumn had established itself with particular quality of intensity that seemed to mirror the increasing complexity of Charlotte's situation. The weeks following James's first visit had been characterized by what could only be described as campaign, subtle, socially acceptable, yet unmistakably designed to position Charlotte as inadequate to her role. James had begun to appear regularly at social gatherings where Charlotte was present, had conducted himself with courtesy that was technically unassailable, yet carried clear implication of skepticism regarding her capability. More dangerously, he had begun to cultivate relationship with Lord Edward Blackstone, distant cousin whose position in line of succession was so remote as to render him generally irrelevant to family matters, yet who possessed sufficient aristocratic standing to make his opinions regarding household and family matters appear to carry weight. It was during a particular gathering at the home of the Marquis of Lansdowne that Blackstone had revealed his intention more directly. Charlotte had been engaged in conversation with the Marquis's wife, woman of considerable intelligence and warmth, when Blackstone had maneuvered himself into position to engage her in conversation that was simultaneously charming and subtly undermining. "The Duke has done something quite extraordinary in selecting you as wife," Blackstone had observed, in tone that had managed to suggest both compliment and puzzlement. "One wonders what circumstances might have motivated so uncharacteristic a choice. The Duke has always maintained such elevated standards regarding alliance and connection. One is prompted to speculate regarding what particular qualities you possess that have resulted in such remarkable elevation of circumstance." "The Duke has been kind enough to regard me as capable of fulfilling the obligations of my position," Charlotte had replied, maintaining composure, despite recognizing the particular quality of venom that Blackstone was injecting into seemingly innocent observation. "I trust that my management of household and my attention to the obligations of Duchess will demonstrate the appropriateness of his selection." "I am certain of it," Blackstone had replied, with smile that did not extend to his eyes. "It is only that one hears certain rumors regarding the Duke's health. One hears suggestions that his condition may be more significant than is generally acknowledged. One wonders, should such rumors contain foundation, in fact, what might be the implications for a woman in your particular position? Should the Duke's health prove inadequate to the demands of particular aspects of marriage? One wonders how long society might regard such marriage as legitimate obligation for a woman of your youth and capability." The implication had been unmistakable. Blackstone was suggesting that Adrian's condition might render him incapable of fathering heir, and therefore incapable of fulfilling the primary obligation that Adrian had undertaken in marrying. The suggestion had carried secondary implication that Charlotte's marriage to Adrian might therefore be regarded as incomplete, as subject to dissolution, as opportunity for her to seek more complete partnership with man more adequately equipped to fulfill marital obligations. Charlotte had departed the gathering that evening in state of considerable agitation, had found herself unable to focus on ordinary household matters, had spent the night in restless uncertainty regarding how to address what Blackstone had articulated. She had recognized that the suggestion he had offered represented genuine threat, not to her position precisely, but to the fundamental purpose that the marriage was designed to serve. The following morning, she had requested meeting with Adrian. He had received her in his study, a room that served as center of his administrative work, characterized by substantial desk, numerous documents, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation. He had appeared somewhat better than he had appeared in previous days, suggesting that he was having a period of relative physical stability. Blackstone made particular observations regarding your health during the gathering at the Marquess's home yesterday evening, Charlotte had said, having determined that directness was preferable to elaborate circling of the issue. He suggested that rumors regarding the significance of your condition are circulating within society. He suggested that such rumors might call into question the legitimacy of the marriage, should you prove incapable of fulfilling the procreative obligations that the marriage is designed to address. Adrian had regarded her with expression that had suggested he was not surprised by this information, that he had anticipated precisely such campaign, and had been waiting for Charlotte to encounter it directly. Blackstone is motivated by self-interest, Adrian had replied with careful precision. Blackstone is calculating that should I prove incapable of producing heir, my position as Duke might be called into question. Should my legitimacy as Duke be successfully challenged, the succession would be thrown into sufficient chaos that various cousins, including Blackstone, might position themselves as candidates for the title. This is what motivates his suggestion that my condition might render the marriage incomplete. And is the suggestion without foundation? Charlotte had asked, the question emerging with combination of courage and anxiety. Adrian, I require to know the truth. I require to know whether you are capable of producing heir. I require to know whether the purpose for which this marriage was undertaken is achievable, or whether it is merely purpose that you are hoping to achieve. Adrian had stood then, had moved to the window, had positioned himself in manner that suggested the conversation was causing him considerable emotional strain. Dr. Mercer has indicated that procreation is possible for me, he had said finally. He has indicated that my condition, while substantial in its limitation of my physical capability in other respects, does not necessarily preclude my capacity to father child. But Charlotte, I must tell you something that I have not yet articulated with sufficient clarity. The procreation of child is not merely a question of whether I am capable of producing biological offspring. The procreation of heir is dependent upon your willingness to undertake intimate relations with me, knowing what you know regarding my condition, knowing what you have observed regarding my physical limitations. He had turned then to face her, and Charlotte had observed the particular vulnerability in his expression, vulnerability that she had observed during their wedding night, but which he had carefully concealed during all the subsequent weeks. I am asking you, Charlotte, whether you are willing to undertake intimate relations with man who is dying, who experiences considerable pain, who cannot offer you the physical companionship that healthy husband might offer. I am asking you whether you are willing to undertake this obligation despite the sacrifice it would require of you, and I am telling you, with absolute clarity, that I would prefer that you refuse rather than accept from obligation, rather than from genuine willingness. Charlotte had recognized in this moment the extraordinary courage that Adrian was demonstrating. He was offering her permission to refuse. He was suggesting that he would accept her refusal. He was demonstrating that despite his urgent requirement for heir, despite the political implications of Blackstone's campaign and James's antagonism, he was placing her well-being above his own requirements. I have come to regard you with considerable respect, Charlotte had said quietly, moving toward him with deliberate slowness. I have come to regard you not merely as man of authority and position, but as man of remarkable character and integrity. I have come to understand that what you are requiring of me is not merely biological obligation, but genuine emotional commitment to partnership despite its burden. I am willing, Adrian. I am willing not from obligation, but from genuine desire to offer you what I am capable of offering. The conversation that had followed had been characterized by extraordinary intimacy of emotional rather than physical variety. Adrian had explained to her the particulars of his condition with clarity that Dr. Mercer might have offered, but that carried far more weight when articulated by man himself. He had explained the nature of his pain, the particular limitations it imposed, the manner in which intimacy might be undertaken with greater comfort if Charlotte understood what particular positions or particular activities would cause him suffering and should therefore be avoided. More significantly, He had explained something that he had not previously articulated: the emotional burden of his condition, the particular grief of knowing that he was dying, the profound loneliness of confronting mortality while maintaining public appearance of health and capability. "I am afraid," Adrian had said finally, in tone suggesting confession rather than mere communication. "I am afraid of death, which I know is coming. I am afraid of causing you suffering through my illness. I'm afraid of dying before I have adequately known my own child. Should a child come from this marriage? I'm afraid of all the things that await me, Charlotte, and your willingness to know me despite these fears, to offer me companionship despite my limitations, to undertake this marriage as genuine partnership rather than as obligation, is perhaps the greatest gift that I have received." That evening, when they had retired to their chambers, the intimacy that had occurred between them had been characterized not by the formal completion of marital obligation, but by extraordinary gentleness and extraordinary mutual regard. Charlotte had discovered that physical intimacy with Adrian, undertaken with full knowledge of his limitations and full acceptance of his vulnerability, generated quality of tenderness that she had not anticipated possible. She had discovered that genuine partnership, grounded in truth-telling and in mutual acceptance of human limitation, could generate intimacy more profound than conventional physical accomplishment. More significantly, she had discovered that she was falling in love with her husband, not despite his dying, not despite his physical limitations, but because of the courage and integrity with which he was managing both. The autumn had transformed gradually into winter, and with the seasonal change had come particular quality of transformation within the household at Ravenswick. The formal gardens had begun their retreat toward dormancy. The parks had deepened into browns and greys. The very air had taken on the particular quality of cold that seemed to penetrate into the bones and demand proximity and warmth. It was during this seasonal transition that Charlotte had begun to comprehend fully what genuine partnership with Adrian actually entailed. The weeks following their conversation regarding his condition had been characterized not by lessening of intimacy, but rather by deepening of it. Not merely physical intimacy, though that had continued with increasing tenderness, but emotional intimacy that seemed to render the physical aspect secondary in its significance. Adrian had developed a pattern of withdrawing to his chambers during late afternoon, time during which the pain that characterized his condition seemed to intensify, time during which he required rest and solitude to manage what he had explained to Charlotte as the toll that maintaining public appearance extracts. Yet increasingly, Charlotte had taken to joining him during these hours, had begun undertaking light reading in his presence, had initiated quiet conversations that seemed to provide comfort to them both. Comfort derived not from attempting to deny the reality of his condition, but rather from sitting within that reality without attempting to transform it into something more comfortable. "You have changed the nature of this household," Adrian had observed one afternoon, as they had been seated together in his private study, Charlotte occupied with needlework, while Adrian had rested upon the chaise positioned near the fire. "The servants regard you differently now. Mrs. Hartwick speaks of you with affection rather than merely with respect. Even my brother James has ceased his visits, which suggest he recognizes that his attempts at undermining your position have proven unsuccessful. The household has changed in response to clarity regarding what the Duke actually requires," Charlotte had replied, her attention remaining focused upon the embroidery she was undertaking, project that Mrs. Hartwick had suggested would be appropriate occupation for Duchess, yet which Charlotte had selected specifically because it permitted her to remain engaged while seated beside Adrian. "The servants have responded because you have ceased attempting to maintain pretense that everything is entirely well. They have responded because you have permitted them to understand that your Duchess is present not as ornament, but as genuine participant in managing the household and supporting its operations." Adrian had reached then, movement that still sometimes caused him visible discomfort, yet which he undertook with increasing ease, and had touched the needlework she was completing. "This is intended for the nursery, is it not?" he had asked, and Charlotte had observed the particular quality of hope that had manifested in his voice. Charlotte had set down her needlework then, and had turned to face him fully. "I believe so," she had replied carefully, having decided that directness was preferable to elaborate concealment. "Adrian, I believe that I am with child. I have not been entirely certain, as I am only recently arrived at the point in the month cycle where the fact would be conclusive, but I have begun to experience certain physical changes that suggest conception may have occurred." I wish to ensure before articulating this possibility to you, but I believe the evidence now sufficiently substantial that I might speak of it. The expression that had crossed Adrian's face had been characterized by such profound emotion, such extraordinary combination of hope and terror and joy and deep abiding fear, that Charlotte had found herself moved to tears by the witness of it. "You are certain?" Adrian had asked, his voice characterized by trembling that suggested emotion rather than physical weakness. "Charlotte, you are certain that there is child?" "I am reasonably certain," Charlotte had confirmed, "though I believe it would be appropriate to confirm with Dr. Mercer. I believe he should conduct examination to ensure that the conception is proceeding appropriately and to ensure that there are no complications that would require attention." Adrian had taken her hand then and had held it with such intensity that Charlotte had recognized the profound significance of this moment, the moment in which the abstract requirement of the marriage had been transformed into concrete reality, the moment in which the theoretical heir had been rendered actual. Dr. Mercer had been summoned the following day, had conducted examination that had confirmed Charlotte's supposition with the authority of medical expertise. He had emerged from the examination chamber with expression that had suggested both satisfaction and particular gravity. "The pregnancy appears to be progressing appropriately," Dr. Mercer had informed them, in study adjacent to the one in which Adrian had been waiting. "The physical signs suggest that conception occurred approximately 4 weeks prior to present date. There are no immediate indicators of complication." However, he had paused, and Charlotte had observed the particular care with which he was selecting his words. "The Duke requires to understand the implications of this pregnancy for his own condition." "What implications?" Adrian had asked, his hand finding Charlotte's and maintaining contact that suggested he required grounding in reality. "Pregnancy is demand upon wife's physical resources," Dr. Mercer had explained. "The progression of pregnancy will generate increasing physical change and physical demand. Charlotte will require rest, will require attention to nutrition, will require careful oversight as the pregnancy advances. More significantly, the emotional impact of carrying child, particularly child whose father's health is uncertain, will be considerable. Charlotte requires support that extends beyond what your current condition may permit you to provide." "You are suggesting that I am inadequate to the demands that my wife will require?" Adrian had asked, and Charlotte had heard in his voice the particular quality of despair that seemed always to lurk beneath the surface of his apparent control. "I am suggesting," Dr. Mercer had replied with careful precision, "that Charlotte will require support from multiple sources. She will require Mrs. Hartwick's attention to household matters so that her physical obligations do not exhaust her. She will require attention from medical professionals to monitor the progression of her pregnancy. She will require emotional support regarding the reality that she is carrying child whose father's life expectancy is limited. None of these requirements are demands that you cannot support her in meeting, but you must not regard them as failure on your part that she requires such support. You must regard them as reality of pregnancy that is universal, not specific to your particular circumstances." Following Dr. Mercer's departure, Charlotte and Adrian had remained together in the study, had not undertaken conversation, had simply existed in proximity that seemed to offer comfort to them both, without requirement for articulation. That evening, Adrian had summoned the Dowager Duchess and had informed her of the pregnancy. Catherine had received the news with expression that had suggested deep satisfaction, yet also suggestion of understanding regarding what the pregnancy would mean. Opportunity for legitimate heir, but also acceleration of all the difficulties that Adrian's condition would create. "You will require assistance," Catherine had said to Charlotte, with characteristic directness. "You will require persons who understand what pregnancy demands. I shall write to a midwife of considerable reputation, woman who has attended births among the aristocracy with skill and discretion. She will come to remain at Ravenswick during the final months of your pregnancy and through the birth itself. This is not suggestion, Charlotte. This is requirement that I shall implement regardless of whether you request it. You are carrying not merely child, but the future of this dukedom. You will receive attention and support appropriate to that reality." The transformation that had occurred following announcement of pregnancy had been subtle yet pervasive. Charlotte had found herself increasingly occupied with preparations, the needlework that would furnish nursery, the consultation with architects regarding expansion of household spaces, the conversations with Mrs. Hartwick regarding what additional staff would be required to manage both the household and the particular needs of infant. Yet what had perhaps most significantly transformed had been Adrian's demeanor. The revelation of pregnancy had seemed to render concrete the purpose of the marriage, had transformed abstract requirement into tangible reality. He had begun to speak regarding the child with particular tenderness, had begun to articulate hopes regarding the child's future, had begun to discuss in concrete detail how he would manage his role as father, despite the limitations that his condition would impose. "I will know this child," Adrian had said one evening, as they had been seated together in their chambers, Charlotte occupied with reading while Adrian rested. "Whatever happens to me, whatever the progression of my condition, I will know this child. I will have time with this child. I will not repeat the failure I undertook with my previous children. This child will know that their father loved them." Winter had established itself with particular intensity, rendering the estates of Ravenswick somewhat isolated from the larger world beyond their boundaries. The snow that had fallen during the first week of December had remained, had transformed the landscape into something of striking beauty, white fields extending toward distant horizons, bare trees articulated against grey sky, the world rendered in shades of white and grey and black that seemed almost to belong to different realm than the autumn colors that had characterized recent months. It was during this period of particular isolation that Charlotte had begun to experience the physical manifestations of pregnancy with increasing clarity. The nausea that had characterized the earliest weeks had diminished somewhat, yet had been replaced by other physical sensations, the particular weariness that seemed to pervade her entire being, the emotional volatility that required considerable effort to manage in public, the physical sensations in her body that seemed to announce with increasing emphasis that she was not merely wife and duchess, but was becoming vessel for human life. Adrian had observed these changes with attention that suggested both medical interest and profound emotional engagement. He had begun to insist that Charlotte take additional rest, had reduced her obligations regarding household management, had positioned himself as advocate for her well-being despite his own physical limitations. More remarkably, he had begun to articulate in explicit detail his vision regarding what the pregnancy meant for him, his understanding that this child represented possibility of redemption for the failures he had experienced in his relationships with his previous children. "I had thought," Adrian had said one evening, as they had been lying together in the darkness of their chamber, Charlotte attempting to find position that would permit sleep, despite the particular discomfort that advancing pregnancy was generating, "that I would proceed through my remaining life with understanding that I had failed fundamentally as father. I had understood that my children would grow to adulthood without genuine knowledge of me, without understanding why I had permitted their separation from me, without comprehending that my apparent indifference masked profound grief and terrible guilt." "And now?" Charlotte had asked, recognizing that Adrian was attempting to articulate something of considerable emotional significance. "Now," Adrian had continued, "I am granted opportunity to be father in manner that I was not permitted to be with my other children. This child will know me. This child will grow up understanding that their father loved them. This child will not experience the separation and the loss that marked the lives of my other children. This child will be redemption, Charlotte. This child will be opportunity to undo the failure I undertook before." Charlotte had recognized in his words the particular burden that Adrian was placing upon the unborn child. The burden of redemption, the burden of healing his past failures, the burden of giving meaning to his remaining life. She had recognized that this burden was not one that child should properly carry, yet she had also recognized that it emerged from Adrian's profound love and his desperate hope. By January, when the pregnancy had become visible in changes to Charlotte's body, the Dowager Duchess had established herself at Ravenswick with increased permanence, had undertaken detailed planning regarding the approaching birth, had begun to orchestrate what seemed to Charlotte to be elaborate preparation for an event that, while certainly significant, would also occur naturally and without requirement for such extensive intervention. It was during one of these planning sessions that Catherine had articulated something that Charlotte had not previously fully comprehended. "You understand," the Dowager Duchess had said to Charlotte, as they had been seated together reviewing preparations for the nursery, "that the birth of son will be an event of considerable significance, not merely to this household, but to the entire family structure. Should you deliver son, the succession becomes clear. James's hopes for the dukedom are effectively terminated. Blackstone's calculations regarding the possibility of his own advancement are rendered void. The family structure, which has been characterized by uncertainty for 17 years, becomes stable and defined. "And should I deliver, daughter?" Charlotte had asked, the question emerging with some hesitation, as she had not previously considered the implications of delivering female heir. "Should you deliver, daughter?" Catherine had replied carefully. "The situation becomes considerably more complicated. The succession remains uncertain. Should Adrian die before the daughter reaches maturity, the dukedom would pass to James unless specific arrangements had been made regarding guardianship and regency. Female heir to dukedom is not impossible, but it is unusual and requires particular consideration regarding succession and regarding protection of both the daughter and her inheritance." The realization that the sex of the child she was carrying carried such significant implications had struck Charlotte with particular force. She had come to understand the pregnancy as personal matter, as fulfillment of Adrian's need for redemption, as affirmation of the genuine partnership that they had developed, as continuation of hope despite the reality of Adrian's mortality. She had not fully comprehended that the pregnancy was also dynastic matter, was political matter, was event that would ripple through family and society in ways that extended considerably beyond the personal and the intimate. She had shared this realization with Adrian that evening, had articulated her new understanding regarding the implications of what she was carrying. "The child is not merely child," she had said, with particular emphasis that suggested emotion emerging from the realization. "The child is heir to dukedom. The child is resolution to questions that have been pending for years. The child is solution to succession that is uncertain and that generates anxiety throughout the family. I am not merely bearing child for us, Adrian. I am bearing child for the entire structure of family and society that depends upon clear succession and clear understanding regarding what will occur when you are no longer here." Adrian had taken her hand then, had maintained contact that suggested he required grounding in reality. "Yes," he had acknowledged simply, "the child is heir. The child is significance that extends beyond us. Yet the child is also, and perhaps more importantly, our child. The child is being created through genuine love and genuine partnership. The child will be born into a household that is characterized by authentic care and authentic commitment. The child will grow up understanding that they came into being not merely as solution to political problem, but as affirmation of genuine human connection. Do not permit the significance of the succession to obscure the significance of the personal, Charlotte. The child is both, but the child is first and always ours." As winter had deepened, and as the pregnancy had advanced toward its middle stages, Charlotte had found herself in state of remarkable peace. The physical discomfort was considerable. The emotional volatility was sometimes difficult to manage. The awareness of all that was at stake in the successful completion of this pregnancy was always present. Yet simultaneously, she had discovered a quality of purpose that seemed to give meaning to all the difficulty. She was bearing child for man she had come to love with profound intensity. She was bearing heir that would provide Adrian with redemption for his past failures. She was bearing child that would secure the future of dukedom, and that would provide stability to family that had experienced considerable uncertainty. She was bearing child that would carry forward into future the genuine partnership and genuine love that she and Adrian had constructed together. This understanding, this recognition of all that she was undertaking and why she was undertaking it, seemed to infuse every aspect of her remaining pregnancy with particular significance and particular purpose. The progression of spring had arrived with particular quality of renewal that seemed almost mockingly incongruous with the increasingly complex challenges that Charlotte was facing. The snow had retreated, revealing the gardens of Ravenswick in all their particular beauty. New growth had emerged from the seemingly dead branches that had characterized winter. Birds had returned to sing in mornings. The world had seemed to be engaging in celebration of renewal and life. Yet within the household, the atmosphere had become increasingly characterized by tension and difficulty. Charlotte's advancing pregnancy had become evident to all, the physical changes to her body rendering concealment impossible, the modifications to her clothing necessary to accommodate the increasing size of her abdomen, transforming her appearance in ways that made her condition unmistakable to anyone who encountered her. More significantly, the increasingly obvious pregnancy had seemed to trigger escalation of antagonism from both James and Blackstone. Where previously their opposition to the marriage had been characterized by subtle insinuation and socially acceptable skepticism, their more recent approaches had become considerably more direct and considerably more threatening. James had begun to appear at Ravenswick with increasing frequency, had begun to articulate openly his doubts regarding Adrian's capability to manage not merely the current situation, but the broader obligations of the dukedom. He had begun to position himself as alternative authority, had begun to suggest to various family connections that Adrian's health was deteriorating to point of rendering his judgment questionable, and had even suggested directly to the Dowager Duchess that Charlotte's pregnancy represented burden that Adrian was not adequately equipped to manage. "My brother's health has declined considerably in recent months," James had stated during one particular conversation with Catherine, a conversation that Charlotte had observed from adjacent room and heard in its entirety through open door that had been left inadvertently unbarred. "One observes that he spends increasing portions of day in rest and isolation. One observes that the Duchess is bearing considerable burden of household management and of the demands that the pregnancy represents. One must wonder whether the strain of all this is not accelerating the inevitable conclusion of my brother's condition." "Your observations are noted," the Dowager Duchess had replied with the ice that she seemed to deploy specifically in response to James's attempts at undermining Adrian's authority. "Your continued suggestions that your brother is inadequate to his position are also noted. And I wish to be clear, James, that your attempts at positioning yourself as alternative authority are neither welcome nor will they prove successful. Adrian is Duke. Adrian will remain Duke for whatever duration remains to him, and the child that Charlotte is bearing will carry forward the succession in manner that eliminates any question regarding your own position or your own relevance." Yet James's antagonism had been paralleled by increasingly systematic campaign that Blackstone had been undertaking. Blackstone had begun to publish letters in newspapers, letters framed as expressions of concern regarding the welfare of dukedom and regarding the capacity of current administration to manage the estates and the families that depended upon them. The letters had not specifically mentioned Adrian's health, yet they had suggested with considerable clarity that questions regarding the clarity of judgment and the capacity of current leadership were increasingly relevant to the governance of the duchy. More dangerously, Blackstone had begun to cultivate relationship with certain family connections and with various society figures who possessed influence regarding matters of aristocratic standing and family legitimacy. He had begun to suggest with remarkable subtlety that the marriage between Adrian and Charlotte might be regarded as irregular, not because of any legal impediment, but because of the particular circumstances under which it had been arranged and the particular motivations that had driven it. "One observes," Blackstone had written, in one particularly damaging letter that had been circulated among society figures and had eventually reached Adrian's attention, that certain recent marriages among the aristocracy have been undertaken with motivations that raise questions regarding the suitability of the union and regarding the capacity of one party to fulfill the obligations that marriage requires. Whereas previously such marriages would have been universally regarded as inappropriate, changing circumstances have rendered such unions increasingly common. The question that society must address is whether such arrangements serve the interests of family and of broader society, or whether they represent abdication of the responsibility that comes with aristocratic position and privilege. The publication of this letter had seemed to catalyze transformation in Adrian's demeanor. Where previously he had expressed concern regarding the antagonism from his brother and from Blackstone, his response to this particular publication had been characterized by something approaching coldness that had suggested that Adrian recognized the real threat that Blackstone represented. "He is attempting to call into question the legitimacy of our marriage," Adrian had said to Charlotte, with particular clarity that had suggested he was not attempting to shield her from the full reality of what was occurring. "He is attempting to suggest that because I married you without formal courtship, because I married you relatively quickly, because I married you under circumstances that were governed by practical requirement rather than by romantic sentiment, the marriage itself is somehow irregular or illegitimate. He is attempting to suggest that any child produced from this marriage is therefore questionable in its legitimacy. Can he succeed in such suggestion?" Charlotte had asked, anxiety manifesting in her voice despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Adrian, can he actually call into question the legitimacy of our marriage or of our child?" "Legally, no," Adrian had replied, with precision that suggested he had already consulted regarding this matter. "Legally, the marriage is entirely sound. You are my legitimate wife. Any child born to us is legitimate heir to the dukedom. The law supports all of this absolutely. Yet, he had paused, and Charlotte had observed the particular weight of what he was about to articulate. Society does not operate merely according to law. Society operates also according to perception and narrative. Blackstone is not attempting to prove that the marriage is illegitimate. He is attempting to suggest that it is irregular enough that reasonable people might question it. He is attempting to create perception that renders the marriage and the heir less legitimate in the eyes of society and in the eyes of those who will inherit responsibility for estate and dukedom following my death. The realization that the child she was bearing was not merely being threatened by the practical reality of Adrian's mortality, but was also being threatened by the systematic campaign that Blackstone was undertaking, had struck Charlotte with particular force. She had recognized that her pregnancy, far from resolving the tensions and uncertainties that had characterized the family since Adrian's ascension to the dukedom, had actually intensified them. She had recognized that the child would be born into an environment characterized not merely by the sadness of Adrian's impending death, but by the social and familial complications that Blackstone's antagonism was generating. She had expressed these concerns to Adrian, and his response had suggested that he had been contemplating similar thoughts. "This is part of why I required to marry," Adrian had said with particular gravity. "This is part of why I required to secure legitimate heir before my condition deteriorated further. Because without such heir, the succession becomes question open to interpretation and to manipulation. With such heir, the succession becomes clear, becomes irrefutable, becomes matter that cannot be contended by men such as Blackstone, who seek to advance their own position through creation of doubt and uncertainty. But the antagonism does not end merely because I have borne child," Charlotte had observed, the realization emerging with painful clarity. "The antagonism will continue. Blackstone will continue to suggest that the child is not truly yours, that the circumstances of the child's conception are irregular, that the legitimacy of the heir is questionable. He will continue this campaign for years, perhaps throughout the child's life." "Yes," Adrian had confirmed, with the directness that she had come to expect from him. "He will. And our child, our beloved child who will carry forward the dukedom and will carry forward what we have built together, must be raised with understanding that such antagonism exists, must be raised with strength sufficient to withstand it, must be raised with knowledge that their legitimacy is absolute and that their right to inherit is unquestionable. This is part of what you are creating when you bear this child, Charlotte. You are creating not merely heir but human being who will be required to navigate considerable complexity and considerable opposition. This is the reality of what the marriage has created." By late spring, as the pregnancy had advanced toward its final stages, Charlotte had begun to experience the particular combination of physical discomfort and emotional intensity that seemed to characterize the conclusion of carrying child to term. The nausea that had characterized the early months had entirely dissipated, yet had been replaced by discomfort of different variety. The particular strain on her back from the considerable weight she was carrying, the difficulty in finding position that permitted sleep, the constant physical awareness of the child within her, constant reminder of the reality that she was approaching the moment when the abstract notion of child would transform into actual human being. The midwife that the Dowager Duchess had arranged had arrived in late May, woman of perhaps 60 years who carried herself with the authority of someone who had overseen numerous births and who possessed both medical knowledge and practical wisdom regarding what pregnancy and childbirth entailed. Mrs. Cordelia Hastings had proven to be considerably more than Charlotte had anticipated. She had conducted thorough examination, had provided specific guidance regarding what Charlotte might expect as the pregnancy advanced further, and most importantly, had offered realistic perspective regarding what childbirth would actually entail. Many women are raised believing that childbirth is something to be endured in silence, with minimal acknowledgement of the physical reality of what is occurring, Mrs. Hastings had stated during one of her consultations with Charlotte, as she had been preparing decoctions intended to strengthen Charlotte for the ordeal ahead. "But I believe that women benefit from understanding that childbirth is neither mystery nor shameful occurrence. It is biological reality, challenging, yes, and potentially painful, but it is process that women's bodies are designed to undertake. Understanding this, accepting this, preparing oneself mentally and physically for this reality generates capacity to navigate the experience with greater capability and with less terror." Adrian had insisted upon attending these consultations, had positioned himself in role of interested partner rather than as observer, maintaining appropriate distance. His presence during these discussions had seemed somewhat unusual to Mrs. Hastings, yet she had responded with grace and had included him in her explanations regarding what the pregnancy would require and what the birth would entail. "The birth will be difficult," Mrs. Hastings had stated plainly, looking directly at Adrian as she had articulated this reality. "The Duchess is young and healthy, which are factors in her favor, but she will experience significant pain, will require considerable courage, and will require extensive physical effort. Her body will be pushed to limits that she has not previously experienced. You," she had gestured toward Adrian, "will require to understand that your presence may be either help or hindrance to her well-being. Your task will be to support her in whatever manner she requires, recognizing that her needs during the birth may be different from her needs during remainder of pregnancy, and that your role must be flexible and responsive to those changing requirements." Adrian had acknowledged this guidance with solemnity that suggested he was taking seriously the responsibility that Mrs. Hastings was articulating. By late June, as the pregnancy had advanced into its final month, Charlotte had begun to experience the particular combination of physical discomfort and emotional intensity that seemed to suggest the body was preparing itself for the enormous work that childbirth would require. She had experienced occasional episodes where her body seemed to contract without warning, where pain would grip her abdomen and then release without apparent reason. Mrs. Hastings had explained that these were preliminary contractions, that the body was engaging in practice for the actual labor, that these experiences were normal and necessary part of the progression toward birth. Yet, what had perhaps most significantly occupied Charlotte's emotional attention during this period had been the particular realization that the abstract notion of child was about to become absolutely concrete. She was going to be mother. She was going to bring new human being into existence. She was going to undertake responsibility for small, vulnerable person who was entirely dependent upon her for survival. The weight of this understanding had seemed at times almost crushing in its implications. She had contemplated what it would mean to be mother to child whose father was dying, to know that the child would not have throughout their life the presence of father that they deserved. She had contemplated what it would mean to raise child in household characterized by the particular complexity of Adrian's illness and his impending death. She had contemplated what it would mean to protect child from the antagonism and the skepticism that Blackstone and James represented. She had shared these anxieties with Adrian during one of the evenings when they had been lying together in the darkness of their chamber, Charlotte attempting to find position that her increasingly cumbersome body would permit. "I am afraid," she had articulated simply, "I am afraid that I will not be adequate to the demands of motherhood. I am afraid that I will fail the child, as I fear you feel that you have failed your other children. I am afraid that I will be insufficient to the task that I am about to undertake." "Charlotte," Adrian had replied, and she had perceived in his voice the particular quality of love that had deepened across the months of their marriage. "No parent is ever entirely adequate to the demands of parenthood. All parents possess doubts, possess fears, possess awareness of their own limitations. What matters is that you are undertaking this with full awareness of what it means, with commitment to doing your best, despite the inevitable moments when you will fall short. What matters is that you are choosing to be present, to be engaged, to be loving toward the child we are creating together." He had paused, and she had heard him managing the particular kind of pain that seemed to be intensifying as the months advanced. "I will not be present throughout the child's life," Adrian had continued, with the directness that she had come to expect and to value from him. "This is reality that we must both acknowledge clearly. The child will grow up without father, but the child will grow up knowing that they were loved, that they were wanted, that they were celebrated, that they came into being through genuine partnership and genuine commitment. This is what you are offering the child, Charlotte. This is what I am offering, within the limitations of my condition. This is perhaps more than some children receive." By the final week of June, as the summer had begun to establish itself with particular intensity of heat, Charlotte had begun to recognize the particular signs that Mrs. Hastings had described as indicators that labor was approaching. The practice contractions had become more regular, more intense. The child within her had seemed to settle into particular position, had seemed to be assuming the orientation necessary for the difficult journey of birth. The household had seemed to recognize that the conclusion of the pregnancy was approaching. Mrs. Hartwick had finalized preparations to the nursery, had ensured that all the necessary supplies for caring for newborn were available, had positioned herself with particular attentiveness toward Charlotte's well-being. The Dowager Duchess had arranged for additional household staff to manage household operations, while Mrs. Hastings and Charlotte were occupied with the demands of childbirth. Even Adrian, despite his own declining health, had seemed to position himself with particular presence, had seemed to be recognizing that the moment of transformation was approaching, that the child they had created together was about to enter the world. The first day of July had arrived with remarkable heat, the kind of intense summer temperature that seemed to settle over the estates and render all movement laborious and all thought concentrated upon the simple necessity of remaining cool. Charlotte had spent the day occupied with light activity, walking through the cooler corridors of the house, resting in the shade of the gardens, attempting to maintain engagement with the ordinary matters of household, despite the particular intensity of physical discomfort that the final stage of pregnancy was generating. It had been during the late afternoon, as Charlotte had been resting in the drawing room with needlework abandoned beside her, the intricate work no longer possible given the difficulty of sustaining attention, that Mrs. Hastings had arrived at her side with expression that suggested particular significance. "I believe the child will arrive within the next day or two," Mrs. Hastings had stated, having conducted the examination that she undertook regularly to assess the progression of pregnancy. "The body has positioned itself appropriately for birth. The contractions have established pattern that suggests the labor may be approaching. You should prepare yourself mentally for what is coming. You should ensure that you are as rested as possible, as the experience ahead will require considerable physical and emotional resources." Charlotte had nodded, had felt simultaneously the particular quality of anticipation and the particular quality of terror that seemed to characterize the approach of such significant event. Adrian had been summoned, had appeared in the drawing room within moments of Mrs. Hastings's assessment, and had positioned himself beside Charlotte with the particular kind of solicitous attention that had characterized his behavior throughout the pregnancy. He had taken her hand, had maintained contact that seemed to communicate without words the profound significance of what was approaching. "Tomorrow," he had said simply, "or perhaps the day following tomorrow, we will be parents. The abstract notion of child will become concrete reality. The heir that I have required will exist in the world as separate human being. Are you prepared for this, Charlotte? Are you ready to undertake what lies ahead?" "I am not certain that one is ever truly prepared for such transformation," Charlotte had replied, recognizing that honesty was preferable to false assertion of confidence. "But I am as prepared as one can be. I am ready to meet the child we have created. I am ready to undertake the work of bringing that child into existence, however difficult it proves to be." The night that had followed had been characterized by increased intensity of the practice contractions, the body's rehearsal for the actual labor that would come. Charlotte had slept fitfully, had awakened multiple times throughout the night when contractions had intensified, had found herself grateful for Adrian's presence in the chamber, grateful for the particular comfort that his presence provided, even when he had been unable to offer anything beyond his hand and his steady attention to her well-being. The 2nd of July had arrived with continued heat, with the sense throughout the household that something significant was approaching. Charlotte had undertaken minimal activity, had focused upon rest, had attempted to conserve the energy that she would require for the demands that childbirth would impose. By late afternoon, as the heat had reached its most intense point, and as the entire household had seemed to be moving in slow motion, characteristic of extreme weather, the practice contractions had begun to take on different quality. Where previously they had been relatively mild, uncomfortable but not genuinely painful, they had begun to generate intensity that suggested the false labor was transitioning into genuine labor. Mrs. Hastings had been summoned. She had conducted examination, had emerged with expression that suggested the moment had arrived. "The labor is beginning," she had stated simply. "Not yet active labor, but the early stages of genuine labor. You should prepare your chambers for birth. The child will likely arrive during the night or in the early morning hours. We will proceed as slowly as the body requires, and we will not accelerate the process unless complications arise." The Dowager Duchess had been informed. Adrian had been ensured that he was present and aware. Mrs. Hartwick had positioned herself in attendance, ready to assist with whatever might be required. The household had seemed to shift into different configuration, all focus concentrated upon the singular reality that somewhere in the coming hours the child would arrive. As evening had descended, and as the heat had gradually given way to the relative coolness of night, Charlotte had found herself in a state of remarkable calm. The fear that had characterized much of her pregnancy had seemed to diminish. In its place had come clarity, clarity regarding what she was undertaking, clarity regarding why she was undertaking it, clarity regarding what it would mean for her life, and for the life of the child who was about to be born. She had understood, finally, the full significance of what the marriage had created. The marriage had begun as transaction, exchange of security and position for obligation and sacrifice. It had evolved into genuine partnership, into relationship grounded in authentic care and authentic commitment. And now, as the labor had been about to commence, she had understood that the marriage had been about creating vessel through which new life would enter the world, life that would carry forward not merely the dukedom, but the values and the understanding of genuine partnership that she and Adrian had constructed together. "I am ready," she had said to Adrian in the quiet of the hours before labor would intensify. "I am ready to undertake this. I am ready to bring our child into the world. I am ready to become mother. Whatever lies ahead, I am ready." Adrian had held her then, had held her with the tenderness that had come to characterize all his touch, and had whispered his gratitude for the sacrifice she was undertaking, for the love she was offering, for the transformation she had brought into his life through her acceptance of the marriage he had proposed. "You will be extraordinary mother," he had said. "You will be extraordinary mother to this child who will carry forward what we have built together. And I will be present for as much of this child's life as I am permitted to be present, and what time we have together, all of us as family, will be meaningful and real and genuine." The night had continued on toward the morning that would bring the child into the world. The night had progressed with the particular quality of time seeming to slow and accelerate simultaneously. Hours that had felt both endless and compressed into moments of remarkable intensity. By the time the early morning hours of July 3rd had arrived, Charlotte's labor had fully established itself as genuine labor, rather than the preliminary contractions that had characterized the previous day. The intervals between contractions had become shorter. The intensity of each contraction had become more pronounced, and the physical reality of what childbirth actually entailed had become unmistakable. Mrs. Hastings had remained present throughout the night, had provided guidance and support with the kind of steady competence that suggested she had undertaken this particular work countless times before. Yet even with her experience and her steady presence, Charlotte had discovered that the reality of labor exceeded what she had anticipated. The particular intensity of physical sensation, the seeming impossibility of predicting when the next contraction would arrive, the manner in which the body seemed to demand absolute attention and absolute submission to the process that was occurring. Adrian had remained present as well, though Mrs. Hastings had positioned him in role of support rather than primary attendant. He had held Charlotte's hand during contractions, had offered water for her to drink during intervals of relative ease, had positioned his own body as anchor point that Charlotte could grip and push against when the pain had reached its most intense moments. His presence had seemed almost miraculous in its constancy. Despite the clear toll that remaining upright and engaged was taking upon his own physical condition, he had remained absolutely focused upon Charlotte's well-being and upon the work that she was undertaking. "You are doing extraordinarily well," Mrs. Hastings had stated during one of the intervals when Charlotte had been attempting to gather herself for the next contraction. "The labor is progressing as it should. The body is working as it should. You are managing with remarkable capability. The child will not be here for several hours yet, but the progression is entirely appropriate." By mid-morning, as the sun had risen high enough to render the chamber bright with natural light, the intensity of the labor had begun to shift in manner that Mrs. Hastings had identified as approaching the active phase of birth. The contractions had become less distinct individual events and had begun to seem almost continuous, one emerging from another, with only moments of respite between them. Charlotte had found herself operating in a state where conscious thought was almost impossible, where the entirety of her attention and her physical capacity had been focused upon managing the demands of each contraction as it occurred. It was during one of these particularly intense moments, when the pain had seemed almost unbearable, and when Charlotte had wondered whether she possessed adequate strength to continue, that Adrian had leaned close to her ear and had spoken with voice that had cut through the fog of physical sensation. "Charlotte," he had said, with particular intensity that had somehow penetrated the haze of pain, "you are creating life. Your body is doing extraordinary work. You are bringing our child into the world. This pain is not punishment or suffering. This pain is the work of creation. Embrace it. Accept it. You are capable of this. You are stronger than you know. The words had seemed to shift something within her, had seemed to reframe the pain from experience to be endured into work, to be undertaken with purpose and intention. She had found new reserves of strength, had found capacity to work with the contractions rather than against them, had found way to transform the physical sensation from something happening to her into something she was actively doing. By late afternoon, after hours of labor that had seemed to compress eternity into a single day, Mrs. Hastings had announced that the time for actual pushing was approaching. "The child is ready to be born," she had stated simply. "The body is ready to push the child into the world. When the next contraction comes, you will push with all the strength you possess. You will push multiple times during each contraction, and the child will come into the world." The pushing phase had proven different from the labor itself, had required not endurance but active physical work. Charlotte had found herself drawing upon resources she had not known she possessed, had pushed with intensity that had seemed to originate from deepest core of her being. Adrian had remained beside her, had offered his hands for her to grip, had offered words of encouragement that had cut through the pain. And then, after what had seemed simultaneously like moments and hours, Mrs. Hastings had said words that had seemed to transform the entirety of existence. "The child is coming. I can see the head. Push one more time. Push with all your strength." Charlotte had pushed with every ounce of power her exhausted body could muster, and suddenly, the particular sensation of release, of child emerging from her body into the world, the remarkable sound of infant crying, not the crying of suffering but the crying of life itself, as new lungs encountered air for the first time, the extraordinary experience of witnessing the creation of new human being. Mrs. Hastings had worked with remarkable efficiency, had caught the child, had cleared the airway, had placed the infant on Charlotte's chest with words that had seemed almost to come from distance. "You have a son. You have delivered healthy son." Charlotte had looked down at the creature in her arms, creature that was at once familiar and utterly foreign, creature that carried Adrian's features and carried also the unknown characteristics that would develop and reveal themselves across years and decades. She had looked at the small fingers, the red face, the eyes that were beginning to focus upon the world beyond the womb from which he had just emerged. Adrian had leaned over them both, had gazed at the child with expression of such profound emotion that Charlotte had felt moved nearly to tears once again. "He is perfect," Adrian had whispered, with voice that had carried the weight of all the years he had been waiting for this moment, all the redemption he had been seeking, all the love that had been building toward this singular occurrence. "Charlotte, you have done it. You have brought our son into the world." The remainder of the day had proceeded with particular quality of unreality, the delivery of the placenta, the physical attention that Mrs. Hastings had provided to ensure Charlotte's well-being and recovery, the gradual settling of both mother and child as the extraordinary work of birth had concluded. By evening, as the summer night had descended, and as the household had gradually returned to more ordinary patterns of operation, Charlotte had found herself exhausted beyond measure, yet simultaneously more awake and more present than she had ever been. She had held her son and had understood finally and completely the purpose that marriage had created. She had understood why Adrian had required heir. She had understood why he had selected her. She had understood what it meant to create new life, to bring new human being into world, to undertake responsibility for small, vulnerable person who was absolutely dependent upon her for survival. The transformation was complete. She was no longer merely Charlotte, Duchess of Ravenswick. She was mother, and the child in her arms was not merely heir to dukedom. He was beloved creation of authentic partnership and authentic love. The days following the birth had been characterized by particular quality of time, moving in manner that seemed to bear no relationship to ordinary progression. Days and nights had blended into one continuous experience of caring for infant, of managing Charlotte's own physical recovery, of navigating the extraordinary shift in household operations that the arrival of newborn had created. Mrs. Hastings had remained at Ravenswick, had positioned herself in role of advisor and assistant regarding the care of infant and the management of Charlotte's recovery. She had taught Charlotte how to position the child for nursing, had explained the particular signals that indicated hunger or discomfort or necessity for diaper change, had provided guidance regarding the management of the physical recovery that childbirth required. "Your body has undertaken extraordinary work," Mrs. Hastings had explained, as she had attended to the physical matters that postpartum recovery involved. "You will experience particular discomforts and particular physical sensations as the body heals and as it begins to produce milk to nourish the child. All of this is normal and expected. The recovery will require some weeks before you return to full physical capacity. You must permit yourself adequate rest and adequate nourishment. The body requires significant resources to undertake the work of nursing and of healing simultaneously." Adrian had positioned himself in role of devoted father and concerned husband, had modified his daily patterns to accommodate presence in the nursery and in Charlotte's chambers at times that permitted him to observe the child and to offer whatever support he was capable of providing to Charlotte. Despite the toll that his condition imposed, despite the increasing frequency of days when his physical limitations had rendered him barely capable of movement, he had insisted upon remaining engaged and present. "I will not waste the time that I have been given," Adrian had stated simply, when Mrs. Hartwick had gently suggested that the Duke's presence in the nursery so frequently might be overtaxing his health. "I will not spend remaining months confined to chambers when I might be present with my son. I will not squander opportunity to know this child while I still possess capacity to do so." The child, who had been named James Edward Harrington, in honor of family tradition, yet with deliberate choice of Edward as primary name to distinguish him from the Dowager Duchess's other son, had proven to be infant of particular calm disposition. He had slept with surprising regularity, had taken to nursing with capability that seemed almost instinctive, had demonstrated the kind of physical robustness that Mrs. Hastings had identified as indicator of healthy development. "This child is well-formed and strong," Mrs. Hastings had observed during one of her examinations of the infant. "The Duchess will not experience the particular challenges that sometimes arise with fragile infants. This child will grow with vigor and with health." The Duchess may anticipate that motherhood, while demanding, will not be complicated by health concerns that sometimes burden new mothers. Yet it was not merely the practical aspects of caring for infant that had occupied Charlotte's attention during these days following birth. It had been also the extraordinary emotional dimension of motherhood, the particular sensation of bond forming between herself and the small creature she had created, the particular quality of love that seemed to emerge spontaneously and without effort. She had discovered that she was capable of experiencing love deeper and more complex than she had previously comprehended possible. Love that was simultaneously tender and fierce, simultaneously gentle and absolutely protective. She had experienced moments of doubt, moments when she had wondered whether she was undertaking certain aspects of childcare correctly, moments when she had felt herself overwhelmed by the constant demands of attending to infants' needs. Yet she had discovered that Adrian's presence during these moments of doubt had been extraordinarily valuable. "You are extraordinary, Mother," Adrian had stated during one evening when Charlotte had expressed anxiety regarding whether she was providing adequate care. "You are responsive to his needs. You are attentive to his well-being. You are learning the particular language of this child, how to distinguish his cries, how to understand what he requires. This is not failure or inadequacy. This is the work of genuine motherhood." By the conclusion of the first week, Charlotte had begun to understand the particular rhythm of life with infant. Nursing every few hours, periods of sleep that rarely seemed to coincide with her own need for sleep, constant attention to the multitude of small physical needs that newborn required. Yet alongside the exhaustion and the constant demands had come satisfaction that seemed almost transcendent, satisfaction of watching the child develop day by day, of understanding that she was responsible for this small creature's survival and well-being, of recognizing that genuine partnership with Adrian had created something of extraordinary value. The Dowager Duchess had visited the nursery daily, had observed her grandson with expression that suggested deep satisfaction, had made observations regarding his resemblance to Adrian and to earlier generations of the family. She had positioned herself as available support to Charlotte, had offered guidance regarding household management during the period of recovery, and had made clear her own satisfaction regarding what had been accomplished. "The succession is secured," Catherine had stated simply during one of her visits. "The dukedom will pass to legitimate heir. The future is clear. You have accomplished what was necessary, Charlotte. You have done more than was necessary. You have created not merely heir, but child born from genuine partnership and genuine love. This is greater accomplishment than mere provision of successor. By the end of the second week, as Charlotte had begun to recover some small measure of physical capacity, and as she and the infant had begun to settle into more predictable patterns, she had found herself in a state of remarkable transformation. She was no longer the anxious woman who had arrived at Ravenswick as bride of dying man. She was not merely Duchess managing household and estates. She had become woman whose life had been fundamentally transformed by experience of creating and nurturing new human being. And Adrian had become father, had become man engaged in the most essential work of passing knowledge and love and understanding to next generation, had become person whose mortality seemed somehow less absolute in light of the child who would carry his legacy forward into future. On the evening of the 14th day following the birth, as Charlotte had been nursing the child in the relative quiet of the nursery, Adrian had entered with movement that had suggested the particular fatigue that had been increasing as the weeks advanced. Yet his eyes had been bright with the particular kind of joy that fatherhood seemed to generate. "He is growing," Adrian had observed, watching as the child nursed. "Already he is larger than he was at birth. Already he is developing. Already he is becoming distinct person, rather than merely infant. How extraordinary that transformation occurs so rapidly." "He will change constantly," Charlotte had replied, recognizing that Adrian was contemplating the progression of time with particular intensity. "He will grow and develop and become increasingly complex and increasingly capable. We will witness extraordinary transformation across years." "Yes," Adrian had agreed, and Charlotte had perceived in his voice the particular recognition that his own participation in that transformation would be limited by the boundaries that his condition imposed. Yet there had been no despair in his acknowledgement, only the particular determination to be present for as much of the transformation as remained possible to him. By the conclusion of the third week following Edward's birth, the household at Ravenswick had fully integrated the presence of newborn into the rhythms of daily life. Mrs. Hastings had begun to ease her supervision, had begun to position Charlotte with greater independence in the management of the child's care, had suggested that the time had come for her to begin preparing to depart, allowing the household to return to more ordinary operations. "The Duchess has proven entirely capable of managing the care of the infant," Mrs. Hastings had stated during consultation with the Dowager Duchess regarding readiness for her departure. "She is responsive to the child's needs. She is undertaking the physical care with competence and with love. The child is thriving. There is no reason for me to remain longer. The Duchess will benefit from opportunity to develop confidence in her own capability as mother, without ongoing supervision and guidance." Yet the transition to management of the household and the care of infant without Mrs. Hastings's constant presence had proven more challenging than Charlotte had anticipated. She had discovered that the work of motherhood was considerably more demanding than she had recognized during the period when Mrs. Hastings had been available to provide guidance and support. The constant attention to the child's needs, the feeding, the changing of diapers, the management of the child's sleep patterns that bore no relationship to ordinary household schedules, had consumed nearly all her physical and emotional capacity. She had found herself by the afternoon of each day in a state of near exhaustion that had seemed almost incomprehensible in its intensity. She had discovered that the joy and satisfaction of motherhood coexisted with particular quality of physical and emotional depletion that seemed to demand recovery that was not readily available. Mrs. Hartwick had recognized the strain that the demands of simultaneous management of household and care of infant had begun to impose. She had taken it upon herself to reorganize household operations in manner that permitted Charlotte to focus primarily upon the child and upon her own recovery, had positioned additional household staff to undertake various duties that had previously fallen to the Duchess, and had made clear that Charlotte's primary obligation during this period was to the care of infant and the continued healing of her own body. "You are attempting to undertake too much," Mrs. Hartwick had stated with the kind of direct kindness that had come to characterize her interactions with Charlotte. "You are recovering from extraordinary physical work. You are learning to care for infant who requires constant attention. You are attempting to manage household that is considerable in its scope. This is not possible for a single person to accomplish without assistance. You will permit others to undertake household management. Your obligation is to the child and to your own recovery." Adrian had taken similar position, had made clear that he regarded Charlotte's well-being as primary obligation, and had encouraged her to accept the assistance that household was prepared to provide. "You have created extraordinary gift," Adrian had said during one of the evenings when Charlotte had expressed frustration regarding her inability to manage all the demands that seemed to be impinging upon her. "You have brought forth child, and you are nourishing that child with your own body. All other matters are secondary to this essential work. You will permit others to manage what can be managed by others. You will focus yourself upon what only you can accomplish." By the conclusion of the 4th week following the birth, Charlotte had begun to adjust more successfully to the particular reality of motherhood. She had developed greater understanding of the child's needs and signals, had become more confident in her own capability to respond to those needs, and had begun to experience the particular contentment that comes from growing into role that one had never previously undertaken. Yet it was during this same period that the first real challenge to the household's peace had manifested in manner that had been unmistakable in its import. A letter had arrived bearing the seal of the Marquis of Pemberton, Adrian's former father-in-law, the man who had maintained control of Adrian's children from his first marriage. The letter had been directed to Adrian, and Adrian had opened it with expression that had suggested he recognized both its importance and the particular difficulty that it represented. He had read the contents in silence, had set the letter down with movements that had suggested careful control, and had seemed unable to speak regarding what the letter contained for some minutes following his receipt of it. "What is it?" Charlotte had asked, anxiety manifesting in her voice, recognizing that something of significance had occurred. "My daughter," Adrian had replied finally, and Charlotte had heard in his voice the particular quality of pain that seemed to relate to his children from his first marriage. "The Marquess writes that my daughter, Victoria, who is now 17 years of age, has expressed strong desire to remain with me during the period following her school term concludes. He is offering opportunity for her to visit Ravenswick for duration of summer months. He is suggesting that perhaps it is time for her to develop relationship with her father, now that circumstances permit such relationship." Charlotte had recognized immediately the profound significance of this offer, had recognized that Adrian's first child was being offered opportunity to know her father, an opportunity that had been denied her for the entirety of her life. Yet she had also recognized the particular complexity that the presence of Adrian's adolescent daughter would create within the household during the period of Charlotte's recovery and of Edward's infancy. "You must accept the offer," Charlotte had said simply, despite the particular anxiety that the prospect of managing household with infant and with adolescent daughter simultaneously was generating. "Your daughter should have opportunity to know you. She has been denied that knowledge for years that can never be recovered. You must accept." Adrian had regarded her with expression that had suggested profound gratitude, combined with recognition of the burden that he was asking her to assume. "You understand what this will require of you?" he had asked, and Charlotte had perceived that he was attempting to offer her opportunity to decline the suggestion. "Yes," Charlotte had replied. "It will require considerable adjustment and considerable effort on my part, but it is what is right. Your daughter deserves opportunity to know you, and perhaps," she had paused, considering the full implications of what she was suggesting, "perhaps the presence of your daughter might also provide assistance and support during the period of the child's infancy. A young woman of 17 might offer particular value in management of infant and in support of new mother." Adrian had written to the Marquis that same day, had extended invitation to his daughter to visit Ravenswick for the summer months, had suggested that the timing of the invitation was appropriate and that he would welcome opportunity to develop relationship with daughter he had been prevented from knowing throughout her childhood. By the conclusion of July, as the summer had been established in full force, and as the household had been preparing for the arrival of Adrian's daughter, Charlotte had recognized that the extraordinary transformation that motherhood had created in her life was about to be supplemented by additional transformation, the integration of adolescent daughter into household, the extension of Adrian's capacity for fatherhood to daughter who had been separated from him, and the expansion of the small family unit into something more complex and more challenging. Yet she had also recognized that these complications were preferable to the alternative, isolation and denial of Adrian's connection to his first child. She had understood, finally and completely, that genuine partnership required acceptance of complexity and willingness to navigate the full reality of human relationship in all its difficulty and all its meaning. The arrival of Victoria Harrington on the afternoon of August 1st had transformed the atmosphere of Ravenswick in manner that Charlotte had not entirely anticipated. The young woman who had descended from the carriage had been, to Charlotte's surprise, not the child that Adrian's lengthy separation from her might have suggested, but rather a young woman of considerable maturity and considerable capability. At 17, Victoria had already begun to manifest the particular combination of intelligence and poise that seemed to characterize the women of Adrian's family, yet she had carried also the particular quality of uncertainty that suggested she was herself somewhat anxious regarding what her arrival at Ravenswick would entail. Adrian had greeted his daughter with the kind of restraint that social formality required, yet Charlotte had perceived in his eyes the profound emotion that the reunion with his daughter had generated. He had offered his hand, had conducted himself with the dignity that the circumstances demanded, yet she had observed the particular tremor in his hand that had suggested how much this moment meant to him. "Victoria," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of 17 years of separation and lost opportunity, "I am honored by your willingness to visit. I trust the journey was not overly fatiguing." "I am honored to be invited, Father," Victoria had replied with formality that had matched her father's own tone, yet which had carried also note of emotion that had suggested she was herself processing the significance of the moment. "I confess that I have been anticipating this visit with considerable anxiety regarding how we might proceed in relationship that is so entirely new to me. I am grateful for opportunity to develop knowledge of you." Charlotte had positioned herself to greet Victoria, had undertaken the role of welcoming stepdaughter to the household, and had been struck immediately by the particular intelligence in the young woman's eyes and by her obvious capacity to observe and to understand the complexity of the situation in which she found herself. "You are welcome here," Charlotte had said, taking Victoria's hand in greeting. "I am the Duchess. I trust that your quarters will prove satisfactory. You will find the household prepared to assist with whatever you might require." What had occurred in the weeks following Victoria's arrival had been in some manner nothing short of miraculous transformation of household dynamics. The young woman had proved to be not the demanding or complicated presence that might have been anticipated, but rather a remarkably capable young woman who had taken genuine interest in the care of the infant and who had positioned herself as genuine support to Charlotte during the continued demands of early motherhood. Victoria had begun to spend considerable time in the nursery, had undertaken various tasks related to the child's care, had provided Charlotte with opportunity to rest and to recover in manner that had been previously impossible without Mrs. Hastings's presence. More significantly, she had undertaken these tasks not from obligation but from genuine affection for her half-brother, from recognition of the meaning that the child represented for her father. "He is remarkable," Victoria had said during one of the afternoons when she had been holding the infant while Charlotte had rested, and Charlotte had perceived in her voice the particular wonder that seemed to accompany genuine encounter with new human being. "He is so small yet so utterly complete as person. I find myself overwhelmed sometimes by the recognition that he will grow and develop and become distinct person with his own character and his own understanding. It seems almost impossible that something so small can contain such potential for becoming." The relationship between Adrian and his daughter had deepened across the weeks of Victoria's stay in Manor that had seemed to provide both of them with profound satisfaction. Adrian had begun to undertake instruction of his daughter regarding various matters, some practical, regarding the management of estates and regarding the particular obligations that would fall to her as woman of aristocratic position, and some more deeply personal, regarding his own understanding of duty and regarding what he hoped she would understand about the responsibilities that privilege created. "You are a woman of considerable capability," Adrian had stated during one of these conversations that Charlotte had observed from distance, not intending to intrude, but recognizing the significance of the exchange. "Your education has been superior, your family position is secure. You will have opportunity in life that many women do not possess. I trust that you will exercise that opportunity with consideration for those less fortunate than yourself. I trust that you will recognize that privilege carries obligation to serve, rather than merely to benefit oneself." Victoria had listened to these observations with particular attention, had asked questions that suggested she was genuinely contemplating what her father was articulating, and had seemed to be undertaking the work of developing understanding of what it meant to be woman of her particular position and particular capacity. Yet it had been the relationship between Victoria and Edward that had perhaps most significantly transformed the household. The young woman had taken genuine delight in the child, had undertaken care of him with particular tenderness, and had seemed to find in the work of attending to infant something approaching purpose and meaning. "When my own children arrive, if they do," Victoria had said during one conversation with Charlotte, as they had been sitting together in the nursery while Victoria had kept watch over the sleeping infant, "I believe I will want to undertake their care with the same intentionality and the same love that you are undertaking Edward's care. I believe I will want to ensure that my children know that their birth was not merely obligation or convenience, but was celebrated and cherished. I believe I will want to offer them what I have only recently come to understand, that I have been denied, the genuine presence and the genuine love of their father." By the conclusion of August, as the summer had been gradually giving way to the early signs of autumn, the household at Ravenswick had been characterized by a state of harmony and purpose that seemed almost to transcend the particular complexity of Adrian's condition and the reality of the mortality that was gradually, though sometimes imperceptibly, advancing upon him. Victoria had extended her stay beyond the initially planned duration, had made clear that she intended to remain through the autumn months, and had positioned herself as integral member of household rather than as temporary visitor. The Dowager Duchess had observed the transformation with evident satisfaction, had made comment regarding the manner in which the presence of Victoria seemed to be generating particular brightness and particular purpose within the household that had previously been characterized by the weight of Adrian's condition. "Your daughter has brought life to this house," Catherine had said to Adrian, and Charlotte had perceived in the Dowager Duchess's voice the particular satisfaction of seeing her son engaged in relationship with child he had been prevented from knowing. "She has brought with her the capacity to bridge the separation that was imposed upon you. She has brought also to this household the reminder that life continues, that future extends beyond the particular darkness that one's circumstances might suggest." Adrian had absorbed this observation with visible emotion, had recognized the profound truth that Catherine was articulating, that the presence of his daughter and his infant son had together created foundation for hope that extended beyond his own remaining lifespan, for future that would continue and develop and grow after he was gone. As September had established itself with particular quality of shortened days and first suggestions of approaching winter, the physical reality of Adrian's condition had begun to manifest with increased clarity. The pain that had previously been something he had managed with medication and with careful positioning had begun to escalate in manner that rendered ordinary activities increasingly difficult. The periods of rest that had been interspersed through the day had become longer and more essential. The appearance of vitality that he had managed to maintain through the summer months had begun to give way to more obvious manifestations of illness and declining capacity. Dr. Mercer had attended upon Adrian during one of these increasingly necessary medical consultations, had conducted thorough examination, and had been forthright regarding what the examination had revealed. The conversation that had followed had occurred with Charlotte and Victoria present, had been conducted with the kind of directness that Adrian had always demanded regarding his condition. "The progression of the illness has accelerated," Dr. Mercer had stated simply, not attempting to soften the reality of what his examination had demonstrated. "The internal deterioration is advancing more rapidly than we might have anticipated. The pain will likely intensify. The periods of adequate physical capacity will likely diminish. I would estimate that you have perhaps 6 months, possibly as many as 9, before the condition becomes terminal. You should prepare your affairs accordingly. You should prepare yourself for the reality that the time remaining to you is limited and becoming increasingly limited." Adrian had listened to this assessment with particular calm, had thanked Dr. Mercer for the honesty of the evaluation, and had posed questions regarding what management of pain might become possible as the condition advanced. Yet when the physician had departed, and when Charlotte and Victoria had been left alone with Adrian, the full weight of what Dr. Mercer's assessment had implied had become undeniable. "I am running out of time," Adrian had said simply, and Charlotte had perceived in his voice not despair but rather clarity regarding reality and particular determination regarding what he intended to accomplish in the time that remained. "I have months, perhaps, to undertake the work of establishing foundation for both my children's futures. I have months to ensure that Edward will be adequately protected, adequately provided for, adequately understood regarding his inheritance and his obligations. I have months to ensure that Victoria understands what I believe she should understand about living life with integrity and purpose. I have months to ensure that Charlotte is adequately positioned to manage estates and household in my absence." The recognition that Adrian was consciously and deliberately undertaking the work of preparation for his own death had struck Charlotte with particular force. She had recognized that while she had known intellectually that he was dying, she had not fully absorbed what it would mean to watch him engage in that preparation with such directness and such clarity. She had found herself, in the weeks following Dr. Mercer's consultation, in state of emotional complexity that had seemed almost impossible to navigate. She was still managing the considerable demands of caring for infant in its early months of life. She was learning to manage estates and household with increasing independence as Adrian's physical capacity diminished. She was witnessing the man she had come to love with profound intensity engage in the work of preparing for death, of establishing legacy, of ensuring that those he loved would be adequate to the challenges that would face them following his departure. Yet she had discovered that Adrian's particular approach to his approaching death was offering her model for how to manage her own grief and her own anxiety. Rather than permitting the reality of mortality to render meaningless the time that remained, Adrian was undertaking that time with particular intentionality and particular dedication to ensuring that what he could accomplish would be accomplished fully and completely. He had begun to undertake systematic instruction of both Charlotte and Victoria regarding matters of estate management and regarding various practical matters that would require attention following his death. He had begun to establish detailed arrangements regarding Edward's wardship and regarding what provisions he was making to ensure the child would be adequately protected and adequately provided for. He had begun to articulate in explicit detail his understanding of what legacy he was attempting to create through his children and through the partnership he had developed with Charlotte. "I will not be present to see the outcomes of what I am attempting to create," Adrian had stated during one of these instructional sessions that he had undertaken with Charlotte regarding the management of household finances. "I will not be present to see Edward grow into manhood. I will not be present to observe the development of his character and his capability. I will not be present to provide guidance when he requires it. Yet I am establishing foundation, financial foundation, intellectual foundation, emotional foundation, upon which he can build his life and his understanding of what it means to be a person of integrity and of purpose." Charlotte had recognized in these statements the particular power of what Adrian had accomplished through the marriage itself. He had selected her not merely to bear heir, but to undertake the work of ensuring that heir would be raised with understanding of genuine love and genuine partnership. He had selected her to be present in the manner that he would not be able to be present, to provide the daily guidance, the consistent love, the model of authentic living that would shape the child's fundamental understanding of what life could be. The relationship between Adrian and Edward had begun to deepen across the months in manner that was both tender and tinged with particular poignancy. Adrian would hold the child for extended periods, would speak to him with the particular seriousness that suggested he was attempting to communicate something of significance to consciousness that could not yet comprehend language. He would position himself as observer of the child's development, would note with particular attention every change and every new capability the infant demonstrated. "He is developing at appropriate pace," Adrian had observed during one of these sessions of watching the child, as Edward had begun to demonstrate increased capability in managing his own head and in focusing his eyes with more intention. "Each week brings new capability. Each week the child becomes more distinctly himself. It is extraordinary to witness the emergence of person, and it is simultaneously crushing to recognize that I will not be present to witness the entire emergence, the entire development, the entire becoming." Yet rather than permitting this recognition to diminish his engagement with the child, Adrian had seemed to redouble his attention and his commitment to being present for whatever time remained. He had begun to establish particular rituals, particular times each day when he would hold the child, would speak to him, would offer the blessing of his presence and his attention. "You are undertaking work of fatherhood with extraordinary integrity," Charlotte had said to Adrian, recognizing the particular dedication that he was demonstrating, despite the increasing toll that such engagement was extracting from his diminishing physical capacity. "You are offering the child what you were prevented from offering to your other children. You are offering him the foundation of genuine love and genuine presence that will shape everything he becomes." "Yes," Adrian had replied, with the particular calm that had come to characterize his response to his approaching death. "This is what I intend. This is what will remain when I am gone. Not the achievements or the position or the wealth, but the particular quality of love and presence that I have attempted to offer to this child and to his mother. This is legacy, that I hope will be sufficient. October had arrived with particular quality of beauty that seemed almost to mock the reality of Adrian's deteriorating condition. The estates of Ravenswick had transformed into landscape of extraordinary colour, the trees blazing with oranges and reds and deep yellows, the gardens settling into the particular beauty of autumn bloom, the very air seeming to contain quality of melancholy recognition that the season of growth had concluded and that the season of dormancy was approaching. Yet if the natural world was settling into rhythms of decline and preparation for winter, Adrian had begun to undertake his own particular kind of preparation, one that was far more deliberate and far more conscious than the natural progression of seasons. He had begun to position himself as man aware that his time was becoming increasingly limited, and he had responded by undertaking with particular intensity the work of ensuring that what he could accomplish would be accomplished fully and completely before his time expired. The physical reality of his condition had become increasingly evident to all who inhabited the household. The periods of apparent health and capability that had characterized the summer months had become rarer and briefer. He had begun to spend considerable portions of the day confined to his chambers, emerging only when he possessed sufficient reserves of energy and sufficient pain management to permit movement. The particular gauntness that illness creates had become increasingly pronounced, rendering his frame diminished in manner that suggested the disease was consuming him from within. Yet what had perhaps most significantly transformed was the particular intensity with which Adrian had begun to engage with both of his children. Edward, now nearly 4 months old, had begun to demonstrate the particular capabilities of advanced infant. He had begun to engage with visual attention more deliberately, had begun to vocalize with increased intentionality, had begun to demonstrate the particular emerging personality that suggested he was becoming distinct human being rather than merely biological creature requiring care. Adrian had begun to undertake what might be described as ritual engagement with the child, particular times each day when he would hold Edward, would speak to him with the seriousness that suggested he was attempting to communicate something essential despite the infant's incapacity to comprehend language. He would position the child in manner that permitted direct visual contact, would gaze at his son's face with intensity that suggested he was attempting to memorize every detail, every particular characteristic of the small person he had created. "He will not remember me," Adrian had said to Charlotte during one of these sessions, and she had perceived in his voice the particular grief that accompanied the recognition that his son would not carry forward conscious memory of him. "He will grow to understand me through your explanations and through the legacy I am attempting to establish. But he will not remember the particular sensation of my hand holding him, will not remember the sound of my voice speaking to him, will not remember the physical reality of his father's presence. This is knowledge that is almost unbearable to me. He will carry forward something more significant than memory," Charlotte had replied, having spent considerable time contemplating what it would mean to raise child whose father would die before the child reached consciousness of his presence. "He will carry forward in his very nature the understanding of genuine love, of authentic partnership, of what it means to be person created through commitment and care. These things will shape him far more profoundly than any conscious memory could shape him." With Victoria, Adrian's engagement had taken different form. The young woman who had initially arrived as uncertain visitor had by autumn established herself as integral member of household. Adrian had begun to undertake her education in matters that extended considerably beyond what her previous schooling had provided. He had begun to articulate in explicit detail his understanding of what obligations came with her position, what responsibilities she would carry forward regarding her own role as woman of aristocratic standing and considerable capability. He had begun to provide her with access to his private correspondence regarding matters of estate management and regarding various family matters that had previously been maintained in sphere of masculine authority. He had begun to articulate his thoughts regarding what kind of woman he hoped she would become. Woman capable of exercising influence with integrity, woman committed to use her resources in service rather than merely in personal benefit, woman who would understand that privilege created obligation. "You are positioned," Adrian had said to Victoria during one of these conversations that Charlotte had observed, "to exercise considerable influence throughout your life. You will marry, presumably to man of compatible position and capability, and you will undertake role of wife and eventually of mother. You will have opportunity to shape household and to shape children in manner that influences their understanding of what kind of persons they might become. I am requesting that you undertake this responsibility with particular attention, to ensuring that you create environment characterized by authenticity and by love, rather than by mere performance of social obligation. Victoria had absorbed these observations with the particular seriousness that characterized her engagement with matters that her father articulated. She had begun to ask increasingly complex questions regarding estate management, regarding the particular investments that the family maintained, regarding what kind of future she might anticipate, and what responsibilities that future would create. More significantly, she had begun to undertake conversations with Charlotte, regarding what Charlotte had learned about managing household and managing estates, regarding what Charlotte had discovered about her own capability in these areas, regarding what Charlotte believed the challenges and rewards of such management to be. "My father speaks to me regarding obligation and regarding responsibility," Victoria had said to Charlotte during one of these conversations, as they had been seated together in the library while Adrian had been resting. "But you are demonstrating to me what it actually means to undertake such obligation and responsibility in daily life. You are demonstrating how one maintains compassion and care for household staff while also maintaining authority. You are demonstrating how one manages complex matters of economy and resources while also maintaining vision regarding what such management is intended to serve. I am learning considerably more from observing you than I am learning from any formal instruction." By the conclusion of October, as the autumn had been advancing toward its conclusion, and as the first preliminary suggestions of approaching winter had begun to manifest in the particular quality of the air and the particular behavior of the natural world, Adrian had begun to position himself in role of man conscious that time was becoming genuinely limited. He had begun to undertake correspondence regarding various business matters that required attention. He had begun to ensure that his solicitor was fully apprised regarding the arrangements he had made for his children's security. He had begun to write letters that would be opened following his death, letters that would permit him to speak to his children across the boundary that his mortality would create. "I am establishing what I can establish," Adrian had explained to Charlotte when she had encountered him in his study surrounded by documents and correspondence. "I am ensuring that nothing I might have accomplished is left undone. I am creating framework within which you and Victoria will be able to manage following my departure. I am creating record of what I believe, what I value, what I hope for my children. This is all I can accomplish now. This is all any dying man can accomplish." November had arrived with the particular quality of transition that marked the movement from autumn toward winter. The brilliant colors of October had faded. The trees had shed their leaves. The world had begun to settle into the browns and grays and blacks that characterized the season of dormancy. The gardens at Ravenswick had been carefully prepared for winter. Perennial plants had been cut back. Tender specimens had been protected or relocated to shelter. The groundskeepers had undertaken the work of ensuring that the landscape could survive the coming cold with minimal damage. Within the household, a similar process of preparation had been occurring. Preparation not for the arrival of winter weather, but for the arrival of the final season of Adrian's life. Dr. Mercer had been called with increasing frequency, and the conversations that had followed his examinations had become increasingly focused on the particular management of pain and the particular timing of Adrian's inevitable decline. The conclusion that had emerged from these conversations had been clear. Adrian had perhaps 2 or 3 months before his condition would become such that he would be confined absolutely to his chambers, and even that timeline would be subject to rapid alteration should any significant complications arise. Adrian had responded to this knowledge with particular clarity of purpose. He had begun to undertake what might be described as systematic effort to ensure that all matters requiring his attention before his death would be completed and resolved. He had called Charlotte and Victoria together on the first day of November and had articulated with characteristic directness what he was undertaking and why. "I am conscious that my time is limited," he had stated, his voice still carrying authority despite the physical toll that speaking was beginning to exact. "I am conscious that the winter months will render me increasingly incapable of movement and increasingly incapable of attending to matters that require attention. Therefore, I am requesting that you both undertake with me the work of ensuring that all arrangements are made, all instructions are clear, all documents are properly executed. I am requesting that we spend the coming weeks ensuring that nothing requiring my attention is left incomplete." The work that had followed had been substantial and had required considerable effort from all 3 of them. Adrian had undertaken detailed instruction of both Charlotte and Victoria regarding the specific management of the 3 estates that comprised the Harrington holdings. He had provided them with written documentation regarding various business relationships and agreements that required continuity following his death. He had ensured that his solicitor had prepared all necessary legal documents, had ensured that his will had been executed with proper attention to all details, had ensured that the arrangements he had made for Edward's guardianship and for Edward's education and future were clearly articulated and legally established. More significantly, he had begun to undertake conversation with each of his children, conversations that seemed to be designed to offer to them in advance what he would not be able to offer after his death. With Edward, these conversations had continued in the form of ritual engagement, holding the child, speaking to him, offering the blessing of presence. But he had begun also to engage in explicit conversation with Victoria, conversations designed to provide her with understanding of what he believed, what he valued, what he hoped she would carry forward into her own life and eventually into the lives of her own children. "I have made considerable mistakes in my life," Adrian had said during one of these conversations with Victoria, and Charlotte had observed from the doorway, not intending to intrude, but unwilling to leave without hearing what her husband was articulating. "I have failed in my obligations to your half-siblings from my first marriage. I have permitted fear and grief to render me incapable of fighting for relationships that should have been non-negotiable. I am hoping that you will learn from my failure. I am hoping that when you have children, you will undertake with them the work of authentic presence and authentic commitment that I failed to undertake with them. I am hoping that you will never permit circumstance or obligation or fear to render you incapable of fighting for what matters most." Victoria had listened to these words with particular solemnity, and when Adrian had concluded, she had approached him and had embraced him with emotion that suggested she understood the profound significance of what he was articulating, understanding that he was attempting to offer to her, through his articulation of his failures, what he hoped might guide her own life and her own choices. Charlotte had begun during this same period to undertake systematic engagement with the household accounts and with the particular operations of the estates. Adrian had positioned her not as secondary manager, but as primary authority, had made clear through both explicit statement and through the manner in which he had begun to defer to her judgment regarding various matters that he regarded her as capable of assuming absolute authority. The Dowager Duchess had supported this positioning, had made clear that she regarded Charlotte as entirely adequate to the demands that management of the estates would require. "You are a capable woman," Catherine had stated directly to Charlotte during one of the afternoon sessions when Adrian was resting and Charlotte was occupied with review of household accounts. "You have become capable mother. You have become capable duchess. You are fully prepared to undertake the management of these estates, should it become necessary. I regard you as entirely adequate to the demands that widowhood will create." The physical reality of Adrian's condition had continued to advance throughout November, rendering him increasingly confined, increasingly dependent upon pain management, increasingly aware that the time remaining to him was not merely limited, but was becoming actively measured in weeks rather than in months. Yet rather than permitting this reality to render him incapable of engagement, Adrian had seemed to respond by investing his remaining energy and remaining capacity with particular intentionality and particular purpose. He had begun to write letters that would be opened by Edward in various stages of his life, letters that would offer to his son in words what Adrian would not be able to offer in person. He had written letter to be opened when Edward reached age of understanding regarding his father's death. He had written letter to be opened when Edward reached age of maturity. He had written letter to be opened should Edward ever contemplate matters of love and marriage and commitment. He had written letter to be opened when Edward became father himself. These letters had been undertaken in great secrecy, undertaken during the long hours when pain and medication had rendered sleep impossible, undertaken with particular intensity and particular care. Charlotte had discovered Adrian undertaking the work early one morning, had found him surrounded by pages of his own handwriting, had observed tears marking his face as he had written. "I am speaking to my son across the boundary of my death," Adrian had explained when he had perceived her presence. "I am offering him what I will not be able to offer in any other manner. I am creating conversation that will be possible only through words written in advance. This is all I can accomplish for him now. This is the only form of fatherhood that will be possible for me after my time has ended. December had arrived with the particular harshness that winter at Ravenswick possessed. Snow had fallen heavily, rendering the estates transformed into landscape of white that was beautiful, yet also somewhat isolating in its intensity. The roads had become increasingly difficult to traverse. The household had settled into the particular rhythms of winter isolation. Fires maintained constantly to combat the cold, activities concentrated within the house rather than upon the grounds, the world beyond the boundaries of the estate rendered somewhat irrelevant by the simple fact of distance and difficulty of travel. It was during this same period that Adrian's physical condition had become such that he could no longer maintain any pretense of health or of partial engagement with ordinary household operations. He had been confined absolutely to his chambers, had become dependent upon considerable pain medication to manage the particular intensity of physical sensation that his disease was generating. The Dowager Duchess had arranged for nurse to be engaged to provide daytime care while Adrian was awake, and while Charlotte and Victoria were otherwise occupied. Yet it was Charlotte and Victoria who had undertaken the primary responsibility for Adrian's care during the evening hours and during the nights when his particular needs were most acute. This undertaking of care, the physical reality of tending to a dying man, had transformed Charlotte's understanding of what her marriage had created and what her commitment to Adrian actually entailed. She had found herself undertaking work that was physically exhausting and emotionally draining, assisting Adrian with the particular physical necessities that his condition required, managing pain medication, offering comfort in whatever small ways she was capable of offering. Yet she had discovered that within this work was profound gift of being present to Adrian in his vulnerability, gift of offering him in the final days of his life what he had offered to her throughout their marriage, authentic presence and authentic care. "You are extraordinary woman," Adrian had said to her during one of the night hours, when he had been more lucid than usual, when the medication had permitted clarity alongside pain management. "You have undertaken commitment that most women would regard as unbearable. You have remained present despite the difficulty, despite the physical demands, despite the reality that you are caring for a man who is leaving you. I am grateful beyond words for what you have offered me." "I am undertaking what I desire to undertake," Charlotte had replied, and she had recognized that she was speaking absolute truth. "I am offering to you in your final days what you offered to me from the moment we married: authentic care, authentic presence, authentic commitment. I am grateful for opportunity to offer this to you." Victoria had undertaken her own particular role in Adrian's care and in the management of household operations during this period. She had taken primary responsibility for ensuring that Edward was adequately cared for, had positioned herself as additional mother to her half-brother, had ensured that the child was shielded from the worst of his father's decline, while also ensuring that Edward would grow up understanding the reality of his father's mortality and the extraordinary nature of his father's commitment to him despite that mortality. "Edward is young enough that he will not carry conscious memory of his father," Victoria had observed to Charlotte during one of the few moments when both women had opportunity for conversation. "Yet he will grow up in a household where his father's presence is acknowledged, where his father's values are articulated, where his father's commitment is evident in the foundation that he has established. This is perhaps more valuable than mere conscious memory." The Dowager Duchess had positioned herself as anchor of stability for the household during this period. Despite her advanced age, and despite the particular toll that witnessing her son's final decline was extracting, Catherine had undertaken the work of ensuring that household operations continued, that staff remained directed and purposeful, that the particular arrangements necessary to manage an estate during the season of its master's active dying were undertaken with appropriate attention and appropriate respect. She had made clear that she regarded Charlotte and Victoria as entirely capable of managing whatever would be required following Adrian's death, had made clear that she regarded the foundation that Adrian had established as entirely adequate to permit the household and the estates to continue forward. Yet she had also made clear that she was available to offer guidance and support should either of them require assistance. By mid-December, as the winter had been reaching its deepest point, Adrian had begun to experience periods of confusion and periods of extraordinary clarity that seemed to alternate without apparent pattern. During the periods of clarity, he had remained engaged with those around him, had continued to offer instruction and guidance, had continued to demonstrate commitment to the particular work of ensuring his children and his widow would be adequately positioned for what would follow his death. Yet, during the periods of confusion, he had seemed to retreat into internal landscape that the others could not access. He had spoken at times of persons who were no longer living, had seemed at times to believe he was in locations other than Ravenswick, had seemed to be engaged in conversations with people who were not physically present. This is common as the body approaches final transition, Dr. Mercer had explained, when Charlotte had expressed anxiety regarding the particular quality of confusion that Adrian was periodically experiencing. The mind is beginning to disengage from the body and from the ordinary reality in which it has operated. It is neither suffering nor torment. It is simply the particular way in which the brain manages the approach of death. It was during one of these periods of confusion, late on the night of December 18th, that Adrian had reached out and had grasped Charlotte's hand with surprising strength and had spoken with clarity that suggested he had returned, at least temporarily, to full consciousness and full awareness of his particular circumstances. "You have been extraordinary," he had said to her, and she had perceived that he was speaking with full knowledge of what he was articulating. "You have been everything that I hoped you might be. You have been mother to our child. You have become capable Duchess. You have become woman capable of managing what my death will create. I am grateful beyond words. I am at peace regarding what will follow, because I know that you are present to care for what matters most." Charlotte had remained with him through the night following this conversation, had held his hand, had remained present as he had drifted in and out of consciousness, had remained present to offer whatever comfort her presence could provide. By dawn, she had understood that the final transition was approaching, that the remaining time was measured not in weeks or even in days, but in hours. The days that had followed the night of December 18th had been characterized by particular quality of waiting for the final transition that Dr. Mercer had indicated was imminent, waiting for death to accomplish what disease had been advancing toward across the entire duration of Adrian and Charlotte's marriage. Adrian had slipped into a state of increasing unconsciousness, had become unable to speak or to engage with those around him, yet had continued to demonstrate patterns of breathing and patterns of physical response that suggested consciousness remained at some level of his being. The household had settled into rhythms dictated by the reality of impending death. Staff had moved with particular quietness, had maintained the fires and the basic operations of the household with minimal disruption, had positioned themselves in roles designed to support the family while respecting the particular privacy that the approach of death seemed to require. Charlotte and Victoria had maintained constant vigil, had taken turns resting while the other remained present beside Adrian's bed. The Dowager Duchess had been involved as well, had positioned herself as observer and a source of steady, calm presence that seemed to anchor all of them to the reality of what was occurring, while also suggesting that what was occurring was natural, inevitable, and properly approached with dignity and with acceptance. It was on the morning of December 23rd that Adrian had opened his eyes one final time, and in that opening had seemed to achieve particular quality of clarity that suggested he understood that the time had finally arrived. He had gazed directly at Charlotte for an extended moment, and she had perceived that he was attempting to communicate something that words would not adequately convey. She had leaned close to him, had positioned her face near enough that he could see her with clarity, and had simply remained present in silence that seemed to communicate far more than any words could have communicated. She had understood in that moment that Adrian was saying farewell, was offering her in that gaze the gratitude that he had attempted to express through words and through action across the entire duration of their marriage. He had turned his head then, with movement that seemed to require extraordinary effort, and had gazed toward the window where the winter landscape was visible, landscape transformed by snow into something almost ethereal in its beauty. He had gazed at this landscape for an extended moment, and Charlotte had recognized that he was contemplating the world that he was preparing to leave, that he was undertaking some form of internal farewell to the physical reality that had characterized his existence. And then his eyes had closed, and though he had continued to breathe, he had not opened them again. Charlotte had remained beside him, had maintained her vigil, had held his hand, and in the late afternoon of December 23rd, as the winter light had been fading toward darkness, Adrian's breathing had simply become more shallow and more irregular, and then had ceased entirely. The moment of death had been unmarked by drama or by particular external manifestation. It had simply occurred, the transition from the presence of living person to the absence of life, marked only by the cessation of breathing and by the gradual cooling of the body that continued to occupy the space where Adrian had occupied it moment before. Charlotte had remained present, had continued to hold his hand, had permitted herself to comprehend that the man who had fundamentally transformed her life had now departed that life entirely. She had not wept, had instead found herself in state of particular calm that suggested her emotions were too profound for tears, suggested that the particular intensity of what she had experienced across the months of Adrian's decline and across the hours of his final transition had rendered her incapable of expressing emotion in any ordinary manner. Mrs. Hartwick had appeared at the doorway, had seemed to understand without being informed that the transition had occurred. The housekeeper had entered quietly, had positioned herself with Charlotte, and had undertaken the practical matters that death created. She had summoned Dr. Mercer, had arranged for the body to be properly tended, had begun the process of informing the household and the family of what had occurred. Victoria had come, had stood for long moments simply looking at the form of her father, and had then moved beside Charlotte and had taken her hand. The two women, one widow, one daughter, had stood together in the silence that Adrian's death had created, had remained present to each other, in manner that seemed to offer some small comfort in the face of loss that neither could entirely process. The Dowager Duchess had arrived, had observed her son's form for extended moment, and then had simply settled herself in chair beside the bed, her own expression suggesting that she was contemplating what the death of her son meant for her and for what would follow in her own life. And in this silence, in this particular moment of transition, the marriage that had begun as transaction, exchange of security for obligation, and had evolved into genuine partnership grounded in authentic love and authentic commitment, had reached its conclusion. What remained now was the work of bearing forward what had been created, of ensuring that the legacy that Adrian had attempted to establish would be carried forward, of managing the estates and the household and the life of the child who would never know his father except through what others would tell him, and through the foundation that his father had established in advance. The funeral of Adrian James Harrington, Duke of Ravenswick, had been undertaken with all the ceremony and all the formality that aristocratic death required. The family church had been filled with representatives of various families connected to the Harringtons through blood or through alliance. The London house had been opened to permit the society figures and the various acquaintances to offer formal condolences. The funeral itself had been conducted with the particular solemnity that the death of man of Adrian's position seemed to demand. Yet what had perhaps most significantly characterized the period following Adrian's death had not been the formal rituals of mourning and funeral, but rather had been the particular recognition by all who had been proximate to Adrian and to Charlotte throughout his final months that something extraordinary had occurred, that the death of a man had been managed with such integrity, such purpose, and such deliberate engagement that the death itself had become affirmation of the values that the man had embodied. Letters had begun to arrive within days following the funeral, letters from various family members expressing their respects, letters from the medical community acknowledging Adrian's particular courage in managing his illness, letters from people who had encountered Adrian throughout the years and who seemed to have recognized something of significance in the manner in which he had undertaken the work of approaching his death. But more significant than these external acknowledgements had been the particular state in which Charlotte and Victoria had found themselves positioned in the immediate aftermath of Adrian's death. The funeral concluded, the formal mourning period established, the household beginning to settle into new rhythms dictated by Adrian's absence. Both women had found themselves engaged in work that was paradoxically both extraordinarily demanding and strangely purposeful. Charlotte had assumed her role as widow and as primary authority regarding household and estates with the kind of confidence that had been gradually accumulating across the months of Adrian's decline. She had discovered that she possessed capability that she had not previously recognized, capability to make decisions regarding matters of considerable complexity and importance, capability to manage household staff, capability to understand the intricate operations through which estates generated income and through which households sustained themselves. The Dowager Duchess had provided guidance and support, had remained present to offer counsel when Charlotte had encountered matters that exceeded her previous experience, but had been clear that Charlotte was fully capable of assuming primary authority. And Charlotte had discovered that the confidence that Adrian had offered throughout their marriage, the particular assertion that she was capable of undertaking any obligation that might be required, had transformed from external affirmation into internal understanding that she possessed such capability. Victoria had remained at Ravenswick, rather than departing for her previous residence with her maternal relations. She had positioned herself as support to Charlotte in management of household and estates, had taken primary responsibility for the oversight of Edward's care and development, and had begun to articulate her own vision regarding what kind of future she would create for herself. "I do not believe that I wish to marry," Victoria had stated to Charlotte during one of the conversations in which she had been articulating her emerging understanding of what her life might become. "I do not believe that I am suited to the particular role that marriage would require me to undertake. I believe instead that I wish to remain here at Ravenswick, and that I wish to undertake alongside you the work of managing estates and household in manner that honors what my father attempted to establish. I believe that I wish to be present to Edward, to support his development, to offer him the experience of knowing his half-sister in a way that I was denied the experience of knowing him from his infancy." Charlotte had recognized in Victoria's statement the particular echo of what Adrian had hoped might occur, the creation of family configuration that extended beyond traditional definitions, the creation of household characterized by authentic commitment and authentic care rather than by mere obligation and convention. The winter had continued on following Adrian's death, had rendered Ravenswick somewhat isolated, had created space for the household to undertake the work of reorganizing around Adrian's absence. The gardens had been dormant, the world had been reduced to the particular sphere of the estate, and within that sphere, Charlotte and Victoria and Edward and the Dowager Duchess had begun the work of establishing what household would become in the years following Adrian's death. Letters from Adrian had begun to arrive as the new year had approached, the letters that he had written in the final weeks of his life, letters that had been entrusted to his solicitor with instruction that they be delivered at particular intervals following his death. The first letter had been addressed to Edward and had been accompanied by instruction that it was to be preserved until Edward reached age of understanding regarding his father's death. Charlotte had read the letter, had found herself weeping for the first time since Adrian's death, as she had encountered her husband's words, attempting to bridge the distance between his departure and his son's future understanding of what that departure meant. "My beloved son," the letter had begun, "I am writing to you from the final weeks of my life, with hope that these words will reach you when you are old enough to comprehend both what they mean and why your father undertook the work of creating them. I am dying, my son, but before my death I am attempting to offer to you what I will not be able to offer to you in any other manner: my love, my hopes, my understanding of what matters most in life." Charlotte had set the letter down then, had recognized that Adrian had accomplished in writing what he could not accomplish in continuing presence. He had created foundation upon which Edward could build his understanding of what his father had valued, what his father had believed, what his father had hoped for him. And in this understanding, Charlotte had comprehended finally and completely that Adrian's death, while genuine loss and genuine grief, was not conclusion to his influence and his legacy. Rather, his death was transformation, transformation of his presence from physical to spiritual, transformation of his fatherhood from active engagement to guidance from beyond the boundary of life itself. The first year following Adrian's death would be year of grief and of adjustment, year of learning to manage without the presence that had been foundation of household operations, year of discovering what strength and capability Charlotte and Victoria possessed when the external support that Adrian had provided was no longer available. But it would also be year of discovery that Adrian's legacy was not merely confined to documents and letters and financial arrangements. His legacy was present in the household that had been transformed by his presence, in the woman he had selected to be his wife and who had been transformed by the marriage itself, in the daughter he had been granted opportunity to know in her adolescence, and most profoundly, in the son who would grow up understanding through all that others would tell him, and all that had been established in advance, that his father had loved him with love that transcended mortality itself. 15 years had elapsed since the winter afternoon, when Adrian had breathed his last 15 years, since Charlotte had stood beside her husband's body and had comprehended that the extraordinary partnership they had created together had reached its conclusion in terms of his physical presence, yet had somehow only truly begun in terms of its legacy and its lasting influence. Edward James Harrington had grown to become a young man of 17 years, young man who possessed in equal measure his father's intelligence and his mother's capacity for compassion and for understanding. He was preparing to depart for Oxford, was preparing to undertake the education that his father had established foundation for, was preparing to begin the process of becoming the kind of man that Adrian had hoped he might become. Edward had read the letters that his father had written for him, had read them at ages of 5 and 7 and 12 and 15, had discovered through the words preserved in his father's handwriting the particular voice and the particular values of the man he had never directly known. He had discovered through those letters what kind of man his father had valued being, what kind of standards his father had attempted to uphold, what kind of love and commitment his father believed should characterize human relationships. Charlotte stood in the study at Ravenswick, the room that had been Adrian's domain, the room that she had gradually transformed into her own sphere of authority, and observed her son with eyes that permitted her to see in his features and in his demeanor the remarkable legacy that her marriage to Adrian had created. He possessed Adrian's intelligence and Adrian's capacity for understanding the complexities of human situation. Yet he had inherited from Charlotte her capacity for kindness, her willingness to see the humanity in all persons, regardless of their station, her commitment to service that extended beyond mere obligation. Victoria, who had remained at Ravenswick and who had never married despite the numerous proposals she had received, had undertaken alongside Charlotte the work of managing the estates and of ensuring that what Adrian had established remained stable and productive. She had become a remarkable woman in her own right, woman who had earned the respect of the tenants and the respect of the family through her competence and her integrity. She had undertaken the role of additional mother to Edward, had offered him the particular benefit of knowing his half-sister as significant presence in his life, had demonstrated through her commitment and her capability what it meant to exercise authority and responsibility with grace and with purpose. The Dowager Duchess had passed away 5 years following Adrian's death, had died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, satisfied that the succession was secure and that the values that had guided the family would be carried forward by a new generation. Before her death, she had written to Edward, had offered him her own perspective on what his father had attempted to establish, had made clear that she regarded him as adequate to the role that would eventually be his to undertake. The afternoon that Edward was preparing to depart for Oxford, Charlotte had received letter from young woman of remarkable distinction, letter that would change the trajectory of Edward's life in manner that neither Charlotte nor Edward could have anticipated. The letter had come from Miss Elizabeth Thornton, daughter of the Earl of Somerset, young woman who had encountered Edward at the estate of mutual family connections during the summer months. She had written to express her particular regard for Edward, had articulated in language of remarkable clarity what she believed Edward's character to be, and what she hoped might become possible between them. Edward had shown the letter to his mother, had asked her counsel regarding how he might appropriately respond, and in doing so, had offered Charlotte opportunity to reflect on what had been accomplished through her marriage to Adrian, what legacy had been established, what foundation had been created that would extend far into future. "You are positioned," Charlotte had said to her son, "to create with this young woman or with whatever young woman you ultimately select, the kind of partnership that your father created with me. You are positioned to undertake marriage not as obligation or as transaction, but as genuine meeting of two persons who are committed to authentic engagement with each other. This is extraordinary gift that your father offered to me, and it is gift that I believe he would wish for you to receive, and ultimately to offer to whomever you might marry." Edward had regarded his mother with expression that suggested he understood the weight of what she was articulating, understood that the marriage between Adrian and Charlotte had been not merely family arrangement, but had been demonstration of what genuine partnership could be. And so Edward had written his response to Miss Elizabeth Thornton, response that had been written with deliberation and with the particular gravity that seemed characteristic of all important moments in his life. He had articulated in language that echoed something of the grandiloquence that Adrian had employed, that he regarded her with particular respect, and that he would be honored to undertake courtship of her if she would permit it. The courtship that had followed had been conducted with all the formality and all the careful attention that aristocratic courtship required, yet it had been conducted also with the kind of genuine engagement and authentic presence that Charlotte recognized as echo of what Adrian had offered to her in the early months of their marriage. Charlotte permitted herself to reflect, as she had observed the development of Edward's relationship with Miss Thornton, on the extraordinary arc that her life had taken, from anxious woman of modest circumstance who had married dying man out of family necessity, to woman who had become transformed through that marriage, who had become mother and duchess and manager of estates, who had learned through the particular laboratory of genuine partnership what it meant to be person capable of. Extraordinary commitment and extraordinary love. The marriage between Adrian and Charlotte, marriage that had begun as transaction, had evolved into something far more significant and far more lasting. It had not merely created child and secured succession. It had created foundation for how one might live in world with authenticity and with integrity. It had demonstrated what was possible when two persons were committed to knowing each other completely and to supporting each other through all the difficulties and all the transformations that life demanded. And as Charlotte observed her son preparing to undertake his own marriage, preparing to begin his own journey of genuine partnership and authentic engagement, she recognized that Adrian's legacy was not merely secured in documents and in financial arrangements and in the stability of estates. His legacy was secured in the transformation he had created in those who had loved him, in the values he had attempted to instill, in the understanding he had offered regarding what mattered most in life. 15 years after his death, Adrian's presence still seemed to pervade Ravenswick, not as ghost or as memory that haunted, but as foundation upon which everything that remained was built. His love for Charlotte had been transformed from active relationship into legacy that would guide them both across all the remaining years of their lives. His love for Edward had been transformed from physical presence into guidance that would shape everything Edward became. His love for Victoria had been transformed from initial restoration into permanent bond that would characterize her entire life. This was what remained when death had taken him. Not monuments or elaborate memorials, but transformation of those who had loved him, evolution of souls that had been touched by his particular presence and his particular commitment to authentic living. Charlotte stood in the sunlight of the autumn afternoon at Ravenswick, stood in the landscape that Adrian had loved, and allowed herself to acknowledge the profound gratitude she felt for the marriage she had undertaken, for the man who had selected her, for the extraordinary gift of having been known and loved by Adrian James Harrington, Duke of Ravenswick. The legacy had been fulfilled. The future that Adrian had hoped for had come into being. And all the extraordinary complexity and all the profound meaning of their partnership would continue to resonate into future generations, would continue to guide and inspire and illuminate what was possible when two persons were committed to loving each other completely and to creating an environment in which authentic partnership and authentic presence could flourish. Thank you for joining us in this extraordinary journey of love, duty, and transformation. Charlotte and Adrian's story reminds us that genuine partnership can flourish even in the most challenging circumstances, that authentic love transcends mortality itself. If this story has touched your heart, we invite you to like this video, share it with those who believe in the power of love and commitment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of romance, courage, and the enduring power of human connection. Please comment below and tell us, what moment in Charlotte and Adrian's journey moved you most? What did their marriage teach you about what partnership could be? We're so grateful for your time spent with Victorian Romance audio stories. Your support helps us bring more tales of love, sacrifice, and transformation to audiences who still believe that the most powerful stories are those grounded in authentic human connection. Until next time, may you know the kind of love that transforms everything, the kind of love that Charlotte and Adrian created together. Victorian Romance audio stories.